Margaret Ellison drove her boot heel through the letter the moment she read the last line. Not once. 3 times. Until the paper tore, and the words disappeared into the dirt of a Montana street, and the people standing on the wooden sidewalks of Willow Creek went completely silent, watching a large woman in a travel-worn dress destroy the only thing a man had left her after she crossed 1,000 miles to become his wife. She did not cry. She picked up her suitcase. She walked. If you've ever been abandoned by someone who swore they would never leave, if you've ever had to build something from nothing, after everything you trusted turned to dust, stay with this story until the very end, because every word of it was made for you. Subscribe to this channel right now and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. Drop a comment and tell me what city or state you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far Margaret's story travels. Now let's go back to Montana, 1883, and watch what a woman does when a man leaves her with nothing but broken boards and the choice to use them. The letter had been wrong from the first line. Margaret had known it on the train, reading it the first time in the gray morning light coming through the window glass, her eyes moving across the words twice before her brain accepted what they said. She read it again, then again. Then she folded it carefully, the careful folding of a woman controlling something she could not otherwise control. And she looked out the window at the passing country, and she did not speak to anyone for 6 hours. I have found someone more suited to my life. Do not come to Willow Creek. Do not come to my ranch. Do not write again. No greeting. No name signed at the bottom. Not Harold Fenwick's careful, practiced script that she had come to know over 8 months and 16 letters. This handwriting was someone else's entirely, which meant he had not even formed the words himself. He had dictated his rejection to another person, and had that person put it in an envelope with her name on it, and somewhere between Illinois and Montana, that envelope had found her, and now here she was. Here she was. She had given up her boarding house room in Chicago. She had sold the furniture her mother left her, the good oak table, the 2 chairs with the curved backs, the small chest of drawers that still smelled of cedar, and something she associated with safety. She had spent nearly every dollar of savings she had accumulated across 3 years of careful living on train fare and stage line because Harold Fenwick had promised to reimburse her on arrival. He had promised that, and considerably more, besides across 16 letters full of descriptions of his ranch and his plans and his hope for a real family. Letters that had made Margaret practical, unsentimental. Margaret, who had survived the death of a husband and 2 bad winters and a business collapse that took everything. Feel for the first time in years like the future was something she was allowed to want. She had been wrong to believe. That was the part that sat in her chest like a stone, with edges, not the loss of the future she had imagined, but the knowledge that she had let herself imagine it. She had been careful for so long, and then she had stopped being careful, and this was the precise and predictable result. She did not cry on the train. She cried once alone in the dark of the second night, quietly and completely. And then she was finished. She folded the grief away, the way she had folded the letter, precisely with both hands, pressing down the edges, and she turned her attention to the only question that mattered. What came next? By the time the stagecoach rolled into Willow Creek on a Tuesday morning in July, Margaret Ellison had an answer to that question, and the answer was not going back. She stepped down from the stage onto the main street of a town she had never seen, carrying one worn suitcase that smelled of river water from a crossing that had soaked through the leather, and she stood in the full July heat with the letter still folded in her coat pocket, and she read it one final time. Then she drove her heel through it. 3 times. Hard. Until the paper was in pieces in the Montana dirt, and the words were gone, and the people watching from the wooden sidewalks were completely silent, and a boy of about 10 pointed, and his mother didn't correct him, and a man in a red apron in the doorway of the general store watched with the particular expression of a person storing a story for later. Margaret did not look at any of them. She picked up her suitcase. She walked to the general store because she had practical needs, and she was going to address them before she addressed anything else. The man in the red apron, square-faced, 50s, suspenders. The color of dried blood moved behind his counter as she entered and watched her with the careful attention of someone who had already decided what she was. Salt, she said. Cornmeal. Dried beans. 4 candles, matches, a coil of rope. She paused, looking at the wall where the tools hung. And that handsaw, the larger one. The storekeeper's eyebrows moved. "That's a man's saw, ma'am." "I'm aware of what it is," Margaret said. "I'd like to purchase it." He took it down. He began adding the total. He watched her the whole time, not bothering to disguise it. "You're the woman who came for Harold Fenwick," he said. "I'm a woman who arrived by stagecoach this morning," Margaret said. "Word is, he married Patricia Ainsworth 3 weeks ago." He set the saw on the counter. "Lumber mill family. I suppose that changes your situation considerably." Margaret counted out her money, $32, all she had, and the saw was going to take a meaningful portion of it. "My situation," she said, "is my business." She picked up her purchases. She walked out. She was halfway down the street when a woman fell into step beside her, neatly dressed, perhaps 40, carrying herself with the confidence of someone who considered social information to be a form of currency. Margaret had met this type before. In every town, in every boarding house, in every church women's circle, she had ever attended the woman who knew everything about everyone and made sure everyone knew she knew. "Mrs. Clara Whitmore," the woman said pleasantly. "My husband runs the mercantile on the corner. I wanted to welcome you to Willow Creek, given your difficult circumstances." "That's kind of you," Margaret said, and kept walking. Mrs. Whitmore kept pace without difficulty. "Harold Fenwick courted Patricia Ainsworth all last winter, you know. I always thought it was strange that he was riding away for a bride when he had a perfectly suitable prospect right here." She paused with the delicacy of a woman delivering a knife slowly. "Though of course men have their reasons." Margaret stopped. She turned and looked at Mrs. Whitmore fully, and Mrs. Whitmore met her gaze with an expression of such practiced sympathy that it had become indistinguishable from satisfaction. "Mrs. Whitmore," Margaret said, "I appreciate the welcome. I don't need the history." She turned back and kept walking. Mrs. Whitmore did not follow. The land. The stage driver had mentioned a collapsed homesteader's claim 1.5 miles out of town. Nobody using it. Ownership unclear was worse than the description. Margaret walked the perimeter of it slowly, the way her father had taught her to walk around any structure before touching it. Look first, understand. First, then act. The cabin had partially caved in on one side. The roof collapsed where the front corner had surrendered. One wall leaned inward at an angle that meant it was considering following. The lumber was weathered and gray, some boards rotted through, others solid if she could reach them without bringing the rest down. There was a fence line with the posts still in the ground, and no wire between them, and a well that she tested by dropping a stone and hearing after a long moment a clean and distant splash. She lowered the bucket. She pulled up cold, clean water that smelled of nothing but deep earth. She drank it, standing there looking at the ruin of someone else's attempt to build something in this country. Then she pulled out the handsaw and started. She began with the collapsed section, moving carefully through the fallen lumber, testing each piece before putting her weight near it. Learning the particular logic of this collapse, which boards had come down whole and which had shattered on impact. Her father had been a carpenter in Illinois, a good one before his back ended it, and she had spent her childhood beside him, not as a helper exactly, but as a presence he tolerated and eventually came to depend on. She had handed him tools and listened to him think out loud, and absorbed without knowing she was absorbing a working knowledge of how structures failed and how they could be made not to. She pulled boards free. She sorted them by condition along the ground, usable, questionable scrap. She found a section of roofing material warped but intact. The sun tracked across the sky, and she tracked with it, moving from task to task, pausing only to drink from the well. Her palms cracked in the dry heat. 3 fingers were bleeding by mid-afternoon from splinters driven in too deep, and she tore strips from the hem of her extra shirtwaist and wrapped the worst of them and kept going, because stopping meant thinking about something other than the immediate physical problem in front of her, and she was not ready for that. She was on the north wall when she heard the horse. She had both hands on a board she was pulling free, her full weight thrown into it, the wood groaning and resisting, and then it gave suddenly, and she staggered backward 2 steps before catching herself, and in that moment of recovery, she became aware that she was not alone. A man on a dark bay horse had stopped at the edge of the property. He was tall in the saddle with the kind of frame that came from years of actual work, rather than any intention about it. Dark hair going gray at the temples. A hat worn back enough to show his face weathered and angular, with eyes the color of riverstone in flat light, somewhere between gray and green, and not quite either. He was watching her with an expression she could not immediately read. Not amusement, not pity. Something more careful than either and more still. He said nothing. Neither did she. She turned back to the board. "That north wall's coming down," he said. His voice was the voice of a man who chose words because he didn't waste them. "Left corner post, rotten through at the base. You load the roof onto that beam, the whole thing comes down on top of you." Margaret set the board down. She walked to the corner post and crouched, pressing her thumb into the wood at ground level. It went in like bread left too long in the rain. She stood. She looked at the man on the horse. "Thank you," she said. "You're the woman from the stage this morning," he said. "I'm a woman who arrived by stage this morning," she said. It was the second time today she had made that particular correction. She was beginning to feel it might need to become a habit. Something shifted in his face. Very small, very brief. "Nathaniel Brooks," he said. "Brooks Ranch 3 miles north." "Margaret Ellison. You planning to rebuild this whole structure?" "I'm planning to have 4 walls and a roof before the week is out," she said. "The rest I'll work out from there." He looked at the building. He looked at her. He looked at the tools she had laid out on the ground with the systematic care of someone who intended to use all of them. "That corner post needs to come out and be replaced before you touch anything else," he said. "You try to work around it, you lose the building." "I don't have a replacement post," Margaret said. "I do." He said it simply, without theater. "Got a pile of lumber at my ranch I cut too much of last spring. It's doing nothing. I'd be moving it off my property." Margaret studied him. He was not performing generosity. He was not arranging his face into the expression of a man doing a good deed. He was sitting on his horse in the afternoon heat, telling her about lumber with the flat patience of someone stating facts. "I'll accept the post," she said, "and I'll repay you when I'm able." "Fair enough." He turned his horse and rode north. She did not watch him go. She went back to work. He returned 2 hours later with a wagon carrying not only the corner post, but 2 additional lengths of sound lumber, a keg of nails that were better than anything she had purchased, and a ranch hand named Sam, who was built like a barn door, and said almost nothing except, "Yes, ma'am," when directed. Margaret watched them unload. She had expected when he rode away that she might not see him again, that this was the variety of offer men made when they wanted the feeling of generosity without the inconvenience of following through. She had encountered that type and knew it well. Nathaniel Brooks was not that type. "Corner post first," he said, looking at the wall. "We'll need to brace while we pull. You have the rope." "Bought it this morning," Margaret said. He glanced at her, at the organized tools, the sorted lumber, the systematic evidence of a woman who had been working steadily for hours, and something in his expression shifted small and specific. "How long have you been at this?" he said. "Since I got here," Margaret said. "Let's not lose the light." He almost smiled. She saw it start and stop. They worked until dark. Sam left when the visibility dropped below useful. Nathaniel stayed. Not by announcement, he simply did not leave, and she did not ask him to, and they worked on into the blue-gray hour, when you go by feel and memory as much as sight. By the time full dark stopped them, the north wall was sound. Both corner posts replaced the worst lumber pulled out and replaced with the better boards he had brought, and the structure would stand through the night and through a week of ordinary weather. They stepped back from it together and looked at what they had done. Her hands were in ruins. She had them wrapped, but the cloth was soaked through, and she could feel the specific burn of worked raw skin with every movement of her fingers, and she was aware distantly that her back was also making its feelings known, and her shoulders and both of her knees. She was also aware with a separate and cleaner part of her attention that she felt better than she had in a very long time. "You eat today?" Nathaniel asked. "I had provisions." "That's not what I asked." She looked at him. In the dark, his face was a collection of planes and shadows. the deep-set eyes impossible to read, but his voice was not accusatory, just precise. "No," she said. He went to his horse and came back with hard biscuits in a cloth wrap and a piece of dried beef. He held them out without comment. She accepted without comment. They sat on the ground in the dark eating. The Montana sky above them was unreasonable stars so thick and bright they seemed excessive, the kind of sky that made every human problem feel appropriately sized. Some things that had seemed in a letter in 3 sentences. A man who couldn't write his own rejection. A town full of watching eyes shrank accordingly. Margaret ate and looked at the sky and let herself be small under it, which was, she had learned, sometimes the fastest way to stop feeling crushed. "You watched me for a while before you said anything," she said. "About the post." "About an hour," Nathaniel said. "Why?" He was quiet, which she was coming to understand was just how he processed things, not evasion, just the actual time he needed. "Most people would have quit before they started," he said finally. "I wanted to understand what you were working toward." "A roof," she said. "More than a roof." She looked at the structure in the dark. Her structure. Already more solid than it had been that morning already. More hers than anything had been in years. "A place that belongs to me because I built it," she said. "That nobody can take away because nobody gave it." He didn't answer right away. He sat with it. She appreciated that the sitting with things, the refusal to rush toward reassurance or resolution. Too many people filled silences because they were frightened of them. "That's worth every board," he said. He left when the moon came up, riding north into the dark, and Margaret went inside her partial shelter and lay down on the ground with her coat rolled under her head, and was asleep before the thought of sleeping had fully formed. She was up before the sun. She worked the early cool hours hard, making the most of them before the heat built. She was nailing a crossbeam when she heard wagon wheels, and Nathaniel came back with Sam and additional materials. She hadn't asked for window framing. Door hinges, a handle, and wrapped in cloth in the front of the wagon, 2 slices of apple pie. "My cook made them this morning," he said, as though this required no further explanation. "You told your cook to make pie," Margaret said. "I mentioned I knew someone who hadn't eaten yesterday," he said. "Ruth draws her own conclusions." Margaret unwrapped 1 slice. She ate it standing up because she had work to do, and standing was faster, and it was the best pie she had tasted in several years, and she said so. Something in Nathaniel's face did the thing it sometimes did, the small movement that started toward a smile, and then thought better of it, or maybe just got there quietly without the full external display. "I'll tell her," he said. "She'll be pleased." "Who is Ruth?" Margaret asked. "Cook, housekeeper. She's been at the ranch 11 years, and she runs the domestic side of the operation with complete authority. I have the ranch. Ruth has the house." He paused. "In practice, Ruth has more of the ranch than I do." "She sounds formidable," Margaret said. "She's fair," he said. "Which is better." The roof was the hardest section. Getting the beams into position required 3 people in precise coordination. And it was during this work that Sam discovered something he had apparently not expected. Margaret climbed without hesitation. She understood load distribution. She knew which end of a beam to take, and where to position her feet, and when to hold, and when to push. She did not need the same instruction twice. Sam worked beside her in silence for a while. Then he said with the deliberate air of a man committing to an opinion, "You've done this kind of work before, ma'am." "My father was a carpenter," Margaret said. Sam nodded slowly, the nod of a man recalibrating something. "Good teacher," he said. "The best I ever had," she said, and meant it completely. By the end of the 3rd day, the shelter stood. It was not beautiful. The boards didn't match, and the window frame was slightly crooked, and there was a gap at the bottom of the door that would need addressing before fall. But the walls were plumb, and the roof was sound, and when Margaret stepped inside and stood in the still dim air of the interior and looked at what she had built from what had been broken, something in her chest that had been clenched since she read that letter on the train, that tight controlled clenching of a woman who had decided not to fall apart, released. Not all the way, not permanently, but enough. Nathaniel was outside, having stepped away from the doorway to give her the moment. That he understood she needed the moment, that he knew to give it without being asked, was something Margaret filed away carefully in the part of her mind where she kept the things she needed to think about later. "It'll do for summer," she said, coming back out. "I'll need to pack the walls before fall." "Hay bales," he said immediately. "I've got surplus from last season. They'll insulate the exterior adequately until you can replace with proper chinking." "You seem to have a great deal of surplus," Margaret said. "I run a large operation," Nathaniel said. There was something in his voice, something low and dry, so restrained that she might have imagined it. But she did not think she had imagined it. "I need work," she said. Not a request. A statement of fact addressed to him directly because he was the only person in this county she had any reason to address directly. "I have enough money for approximately 6 weeks of careful living. After that, I need to be earning." "What work can you do?" "Accounts. I managed the books for my husband's business in Illinois for 7 years. I can manage inventory plan and track supply operations, cook for large numbers, practical food, well planned. I can learn any system quickly, and I can improve most systems I encounter." She paused. "I can also do physical work, as you've had occasion to observe." Howe was looking at her with the careful weighing expression she had come to recognize, the look of a man who was actually considering what she said, actually running it against real information, rather than simply waiting for an acceptable pause before declining. "My supply manager quit in May," Nathaniel said. "Oregon. I've been running the records myself, which means they are not being run correctly. Ruth handles the kitchen, but she's one person, and I've got 12 hands, and every supply number I should be tracking is at least 2 months behind." He looked at her steadily. $2 a week, and the use of the room in the bunkhouse annex if you want it." "I'll keep my own shelter," Margaret said. "That's your choice. $2 is fair. When do I start?" "Day after tomorrow. Give yourself tomorrow to rest." She looked at him. "I'll start tomorrow," she said. And that the absolute absence of surprise on his face, the small nod with which he accepted this, told her something about Nathaniel Brooks that she was going to need to reckon with eventually. She walked to the Brooks Ranch at first light the next morning, and the operation was larger than anything his brief description had suggested. Main house, bunkhouse equipment, barn, storage buildings, corrals, and beyond all of it, the working land spreading north until it dissolved into distance and sky. She stood at the edge of the yard for a moment, taking the measure of it. "You must be the one who built the Calloway cabin." She turned. A small woman stood in the doorway of the main house, perhaps 50, iron gray hair pulled back severely, a flour-dusted apron, and the particular stance of someone who had been in charge of this specific piece of ground for long enough that she had stopped needing to assert it. "I am," Margaret said. "By yourself," Ruth said. It was not entirely a question. "Largely," Margaret said. Ruth's eyes moved over her, once quickly, completely, the assessment of a woman who had made a long practice of reading people accurately, because in her position, inaccuracy was costly. Then she stepped back from the doorway. "Come in," she said. "Coffee's on." It was the most efficient welcome Margaret had ever received, and she appreciated it enormously. The supply records were a catastrophe of good intentions, not dishonest, simply the records of a capable man, doing a job he had no training for in whatever system seemed logical in the moment, with no consistency across months, and no thread connecting one entry to the next. Margaret spent the first morning reading everything that existed, building a picture in her mind of what was actually there versus what had been recorded, identifying the gaps, tracing the consequences of those gaps through the operation's finances. By mid-morning, she had 2 pages of notes and a list of questions. She found Nathaniel in the equipment barn, working on a harness, with the focused attention of a man who found mechanical problems restful. "I need to ask you some things," she said. He looked up. "Go ahead." She went through her list. Every question, including the ones that were essentially asking why a thing had been done incorrectly. He answered each one directly. No defensiveness, no excuses, no performance of authority threatened by the question. When he knew something, he said it. When he didn't, he said that instead. When she suggested a different approach, he either agreed and said why, or told her specifically why that approach wouldn't work for the way the operation actually ran. He treated her, she realized, as a professional. She had encountered this so rarely that it took her a moment to recognize it. By the end of the second week, she had rebuilt the record system from the foundation, identified 4 areas of consistent waste that had been costing the ranch unnecessary money for at least 2 years, and established a supply schedule that Ruth pronounced, with the satisfaction of someone who had been pointing this problem out for some time, exactly what was needed. 2 years I've been telling him the salt stores were being ordered wrong, Ruth said, examining Margaret's new ledger with the attention she would give a legal document. 2 years. Men sometimes need to see the number written down before they believe it, Margaret said. Ruth looked at her over the ledger. You were married. 7 years. He died 4 years ago. Business went with him. And then you came here for Harold Fenwick. And then I came here, Margaret said. Harold Fenwick was the reason. Montana is what I found when that reason didn't hold. Ruth was quiet for a moment, looking at her. Well, she said finally, Montana is not a bad thing to find. It was possibly the kindest thing anyone had said to Margaret since she arrived, and it came with no softness in the delivery, which made it better. The ranch hands were another matter. Most of them settled into a working relationship with her. Quickly she did her job. She was wrecked without being difficult. She didn't require anything from them except the information she needed to do her work accurately, and in her experience, most people responded well to that combination when given enough time. There were several she came to respect, specifically a quiet man named Dade, who managed the horse operation with a competence she recognized as exceptional, and a young hand named Eli, who could not have been more than 20, and who seemed to feel he owed her an apology for the general behavior of men, which she found both unnecessary and endearing. And then there was Carter. Carter was stocky, and certain the kind of man who had formed views early and found the world's refusal to confirm them a personal offense. He did not say anything directly to Margaret in the first week. He said things adjacent to her in the spaces she had just left in the hearing of others. She knew this was happening from the slight adjustments she registered in rooms she walked into, the way certain conversations ended a beat too quickly. She waited. On the 9th day, she heard him. She was crossing the yard to the storage barn, and Carter was in the barn doorway talking to Eli, and she heard her name, and then heard the word useless, and something about her size that she didn't catch in full, but caught enough of. She changed direction. Carter registered her approach and went still with the expression of a man who had made a calculation error. Margaret stopped 3 feet from him, close enough to speak quietly. Mr. Carter, she said, if there's something I've done wrong, I want to hear it directly. That's more useful to both of us. Carter's jaw worked. He said nothing. If there's nothing specific, Margaret said, then I'd ask you to stop. Not because I'm fragile, because it's a waste of your time and mine, and we've both got work to do. She turned. Ma'am, Carter said behind her. She stopped. You caught the salt order problem, he said. It came out grudgingly with the quality of a man paying a debt he'd rather not have incurred. We've been spending double what we should have been for 2 years. Didn't nobody else catch that? She turned back, looked at him. Thank you, she said. That's exactly the kind of thing I need to know works. She went to the storage barn. Eli held the door for her. She noticed that Carter, a few paces back, made no move to contradict this small courtesy, and that was in its way its own kind of acknowledgement. The harder war was in town. She went to Willow Creek once each week, and each trip was a negotiation with a narrative that had already been written about her. The abandoned woman. The replacement. Nobody wanted the large woman from out of state who had showed up for a man who hadn't wanted to keep the appointment. She encountered evidence of this narrative everywhere, in the particular silences at the counter of the general store, in the way certain women's eyes moved over her with an expression she knew well. Mrs. Whitmore had apparently made Margaret's story her primary social project. On the 3rd week, Whitmore was at the general store when Margaret arrived. She waited until there were 4 other women present, and then she spoke across the store in the carrying voice of a woman who had long practice at public observations that couldn't quite be called attacks. "I do admire your persistence, Miss Ellison. It must take considerable fortitude managing in your circumstances." The four women looked at Margaret. Margaret set down the jar she was examining. She turned to face Clara Whitmore fully, and she made sure her voice was the right volume, not raised, not soft, exactly the volume that filled the room. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said, "I've noticed that you speak about my circumstances with some frequency. I'd like to give you the accurate version so you have something true to work with." She paused. "I came to Montana to begin a life. The man I was supposed to marry made a different choice. I made a different choice in response. I have work, I'm good at, a shelter I built with my own hands, and more to do than I have hours in the day." She held Whitmore's gaze for one additional beat. "That's all there is. Anything beyond that is something you've constructed yourself, and I'd ask you to think about why you've found it so necessary." The store was very quiet. Margaret picked up her jar, brought it to the counter, and paid for her purchases. She was halfway down the street when rapid footsteps came up beside her, and a young woman in a flour-dusted apron matched her pace. "Anna Kelsey," the woman said, slightly breathless. "My husband runs the bakery. I've wanted to speak with you since your first week." "About what?" Margaret asked. "About the fact that nobody in that store, including me, and I'm ashamed of it, has said one decent word to you since you arrived." Anna Kelsey's voice was direct and a little fierce, with the quality of someone who had been working up to something for some time. "And what you just said to Clara Whitmore was the truest, bravest thing I've heard spoken aloud in this town in a year." Margaret looked at her. "It was the plain truth." "Yes," Anna said. "That's what made it brave." That evening, Margaret was still in the supply barn after the last of the ranch hands had gone to supper, working by the light of a single lamp, running the numbers she'd been building all day into their proper sequence. She heard footsteps. She recognized the particular unhurried quality of them, and Nathaniel appeared in the doorway. "You were in town today," he said. "I was. I heard about the store." He leaned against the doorframe, looking at her in the lamplight. "Clara Whitmore is not a woman who forgets being contradicted." "I know that," Margaret said. "Are you concerned?" "Are you?" she said. "About trouble for the ranch?" "I'm not thinking about the ranch right now," he said. He said it simply, without emphasis, which somehow gave it more weight than emphasis would have. "I'm thinking about whether you're all right." Margaret set her pen down. She looked at him in the doorway, this quiet, careful man who had come back with lumber when he could have ridden on, who had given her the moment in her shelter without being asked, who treated her work as real work, and her judgment as worth consulting, and her silences as something other than problems to be filled. "I'm more than all right," she said. "I spoke the truth in a room where nobody was saying it. That never makes me feel worse." "No," he said. "I don't suppose it would." He stayed in the doorway another moment, not pressing forward, not retreating, just occupying the space between them with the same steady patience he brought to everything. "Nathaniel," she said. "Margaret." "You don't have to check on me," she said. "I'm not fragile." "I know that," he said. "I've known it since the first afternoon. Doesn't stop a person from caring what happens." He said caring the way other men would have said wondering or keeping track. Not performing it, not decorated, just the word set down plainly. Margaret held it for a moment. "You can care," she said. "I don't object to that." She turned back to her ledger. Nathaniel said nothing more. She heard him push off the doorframe, heard his footsteps cross the yard toward the house, slow and unhurried. She sat with her pen over the page and did not write anything for a long moment. Outside, the Montana dark was enormous and full of stars, and somewhere out on the flatland, a mile and a half away, her shelter stood on its sound foundation, with its straight walls and its solid roof, built from boards that everyone else had looked at and seen ruin, and that she had looked at and seen the beginning of something. She picked up her pen. She wrote the next number in the column. She kept going. The morning Margaret discovered the missing money, she almost didn't say anything. She had been working through the ranch's supply ledgers for 3 weeks by then, building the new system, layer by layer, cross-referencing purchase orders against delivery receipts, against inventory counts, and she had developed a feel for the numbers, the way a carpenter develops a feel for wood, an instinct for where something was off before she could articulate precisely why. Numbers had a logic that didn't lie. They bent around the truth the way water bent around rock, and if you followed the bend long enough you found what was underneath. She found it on a Thursday morning in the feed accounts, not all at once. First, she found a small inconsistency, a delivery receipt for 60 pounds of oats that didn't match the corresponding inventory entry by 12 pounds. She set it aside and kept working. Then she found a lumber order from April that was recorded as $42, but for which she could find no corresponding withdrawal from the ranch account. She set that beside the first. Then a supply run to Billings in February, a trip Sam said he had not taken and could not account for, recorded as $17 for equipment that did not appear in any inventory she could find. By noon, she had 11 inconsistencies spread across the table in front of her. She sat with them for a long time. The numbers added up to $234 across 14 months. Not a sum that would destroy the Brooks Ranch, but a sum that would matter to a man running an operation of this size on honest margins, and a sum that pointed very clearly in a single direction. Walter Grayson. She had met Grayson on her third day at the ranch. He was the foreman, a compact man in his late 40s with close-cut gray hair and a manner of deliberate friendliness that she had noted and filed away without judgment. He had welcomed her with a handshake and a tour of the outbuildings and an explanation of how the supply system worked. That was, she now understood carefully, incomplete. He had shown her the ledgers she was supposed to see. He had not mentioned the ones she had found herself tucked behind the proper books in the supply cabinet, unlabeled, looking like nothing. She looked at the 11 inconsistencies. She thought about what she was going to do. She could say nothing. She was a woman 3 weeks into a job in a county where she had no standing and no history, and Walter Grayson had been here for years and was trusted and known, and accusing a trusted foreman of financial dishonesty on the basis of ledger discrepancies was exactly the kind of thing that could end her employment and her reputation in one afternoon. She could tell Nathaniel directly. That was the simpler path. Walk to wherever he was and put the papers in front of him and let him handle it. She picked up the 11 documents, stacked them neatly, and went to find Nathaniel. How was in the North Corral, working a young horse, a process that required, as far as Margaret could tell, an extraordinary amount of patience and almost no visible action. He saw her coming and read her face across 30 yards with the accuracy of a man who paid attention to things. He said something quiet to the horse and stepped out of the corral. "Show me," he said. She showed him. They stood in the supply barn with the documents spread across the work table, and she walked him through each inconsistency in the order she had found it, explaining the discrepancy, showing him the paper trail, letting him see the pattern, build the way she had seen it build that morning. He did not interrupt her. He did not make excuses for what he was seeing. When she finished, he stood looking at the 11 papers for a long moment. His jaw was set. His hands were flat on the table. "How long?" he said. "The earliest I can confirm is 14 months, Margaret said. "I haven't gone back further yet because I wanted to show you this much first." "How much further back do you think it goes?" "I think," Margaret said carefully, "that if you give me 2 more days with the older records, I'll be able to tell you exactly." Nathaniel straightened. He looked at her. "Do you know it's Grayson?" "I know who had access to these books and who recorded these entries," Margaret said. "The handwriting in the secondary ledger matches his. That's what I can say." "That's enough," Nathaniel said. "Before you speak to him," Margaret said, "I'd like 2 days to complete the full accounting. If you confront him now, he'll know what I found, and he'll have time to construct a defense. If you wait until I have the complete picture, you'll have everything." Nathaniel looked at her for a moment. Not the look of a man questioning her judgment. The look of a man deciding whether he could maintain his composure for 2 additional days. 2 days, he said. "Thank you." He turned to go. Then he stopped. "Margaret," he said. "Yes. You didn't have to bring this to me. You could have looked the other way. Nobody would have known you'd found it." She looked at him steadily. "I would have known," she said. He nodded once. He walked out. The next 2 days were the most careful work Margaret had ever done. She went back through every record she could access, going systematically further back through the years, and what she found was not a sudden crime, but a slow one. A pattern that had started small, almost petty small amounts, skimmed from supply orders, and had grown in confidence and scale over time, the way these things always grew when they went unchecked. The total when she had it was $481 across 22 months. She wrote it up. Clean, clear, sequential. Every entry, every discrepancy, every paper that supported each claim. The kind of documentation that didn't require interpretation, because it didn't leave room for it. She was finishing the last page when the supply barn door opened and Walter Grayson walked in. Margaret did not look up immediately. She made one more notation, then set her pen down, then looked at him. He was wearing his regular working clothes and his regular expression of controlled friendliness. But there was something wrong in his eyes, a tightness that his face had not quite managed to contain. "Working late, Miss Ellison," he said. "I often do," she said. He moved toward the work table with the casual step of a man who had practiced looking casual, and his eyes went to the papers in front of her before he could prevent them. She watched his face. He saw the secondary ledger. He saw the comparison documents. He saw enough. "I hope you're not getting yourself confused with all those old records," he said. His voice was still light. His hands were not. Those old books weren't kept consistently, easy to misread. "I don't misread numbers, Mr. Grayson," Margaret said. "Now I'm not saying you're not capable," he said, and his tone shifted slightly, still smooth, but with something underneath it now, something pressurized. "I'm saying those old records have a lot of context that someone new to the operation might not have. Expenses that look irregular had reasons behind them, special circumstances." "I'd be glad to hear about those circumstances," Margaret said. "Mr. Brooks would also be glad to hear about them. I've set a meeting with him tomorrow morning." The friendliness left Grayson's face. It didn't become anger right away. It became something colder than anger, a flat, calculating expression that she recognized as a man revising his approach. "Miss Ellison," he said, "you've been here 3 weeks. In 3 weeks, you think you understand a 14-year operation well enough to make accusations against the man who's run it." "I understand what the numbers say," Margaret said. "And I'm not making accusations. I'm presenting documentation." "You're a woman who came to this county to marry a man who didn't want her," Grayson said. It came out quieter than a shout, which made it worse. "And now you're working for room and board, and telling yourself you matter to this operation. You want to be careful about overestimating your position here." The barn was very quiet. Margaret looked at him for a long moment. She could feel the weight of what he'd said, the specific cruelty of it, the way it reached for the exact wound it knew would be there. She felt it, and then she set it aside. "My position here," she said, "is the woman who found $481 that belonged to Nathaniel Brooks and don't appear in any legitimate record. That's my position. I'm comfortable with it." Grayson stared at her. "You should speak to Mr. Brooks tonight if you'd like to," she said. "Give him your version before I give him mine. That's a fair thing to offer you, and I'm offering it." He left without another word. Margaret sat in the quiet barn and breathed carefully for a minute or two. Her hands were steady. Her mind was steady. What she felt underneath the steadiness was something she didn't examine immediately, the specific vibration of a woman who had been hit at the exact right angle and had not gone down. She picked up her pen and finished the last notation. The morning meeting happened with all 3 of them present, Nathaniel, Margaret, and Grayson in the main room of the ranch house, with Ruth moving deliberately slowly in the adjacent kitchen where she could hear everything without appearing to. Margaret laid out the documentation in sequence. She spoke clearly and without heat. She was not performing anger. She was not performing anything. She presented each document, explained each discrepancy, identified the pattern, and stated the total. She answered Grayson's interruptions. There were 3 of them, each progressively less controlled, by pointing to the specific paper that addressed his objection and waiting. Nathaniel said almost nothing throughout. When Margaret finished, the room was quiet. Grayson looked at Nathaniel. "Nat," he said. His voice had changed entirely, the smooth surface gone something rough and unsteady underneath. "We've worked together 14 years. You're going to let this woman, a stranger, someone who's been here 3 weeks. I'm going to look at the numbers, Nathaniel said. That's what I'm going to do. Those numbers aren't, there's context. Walter. Nathaniel's voice was not raised. It was in its way much worse than raised. If there's context, write it down and bring it to me. Every dollar that's unaccounted for, bring me the explanation, in writing, with supporting documentation. The quality of silence that followed told Margaret everything. Grayson could not produce documentation that didn't exist. I need time, Grayson said. You have until Friday, Nathaniel said. That's 3 days. After Grayson left, Nathaniel stood at the window for a long time without speaking. Ruth came out of the kitchen with coffee she hadn't been asked to make, and set it on the table, and went back without a word. Margaret sat with her documentation stacked neatly in front of her, waiting. 14 years, Nathaniel said finally. Yes, Margaret said. We came up together. His first summer on this land was my first summer running it. I was 24. He was 30. He knew things about ranching I didn't know yet, and he taught me some of them, and I never forgot that. Margaret said nothing. This was not a moment for her to fill. That doesn't change the numbers, Nathaniel said. He turned from the window. His face was tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. You know it doesn't. I know it doesn't. No, Margaret said gently. It doesn't. He picked up the coffee Ruth had left and drank it, set it down. You did exactly the right thing. I need you to know I know that. I do know, she said. I also need you to know that Grayson is going to be angry in a way that may make things difficult for you. He has friends in this county. He'll say things. He already has, Margaret said. Nathaniel looked at her sharply. What did he say? She told him. All of it at the barn. Visit the night before, the comment about why she had come to Montana, the suggestion that she was overestimating her position. She told it plainly, without drama, the way she reported any fact. Nathaniel's expression did something she hadn't seen it do before. Something tightened through his whole face, controlled but barely. He said that to you, Nathaniel said. He did. In my barn. Yes. The pause that followed had a different quality than Nathaniel's usual pauses. This one had something working through it. Margaret, he said. You don't need to address it on my behalf, she said before he could continue. I addressed it myself. I know you did, Nathaniel said. I'm not questioning that. But there are things a man says on this property to a person working on this property that are my business, regardless of whether you need my help with them. She looked at him. He looked back. All right, she said. The word got around the ranch faster than Margaret had expected, which meant it got around town faster than she had expected, which meant that by Friday, the day Nathaniel sat down with Grayson, and the documentation and the absence of any counter-documentation. Grayson had been unable to produce the story, was already moving through Willow Creek in several different versions, none of which were entirely accurate, and most of which placed Margaret at the center in ways she hadn't sought. She heard 3 versions in a single afternoon at the general store. The first, from a man at the counter, was that the new woman at Brooks Ranch had accused an innocent man of theft, and Nathaniel was going to realize his mistake shortly, and she'd be out on her ear. The second, from 2 women near the fabric bolts, was that the new woman had framed Grayson to secure her own position, which was a thing women of her type did when they couldn't get a man through honest means. The third came from Anna Kelsey, who appeared beside Margaret near the canned goods with the focused energy of someone delivering a briefing. Half the town is saying you should be sent back wherever you came from, Anna said quietly and directly. The other half is waiting to see what Nathaniel does before they decide, and Clara Whitmore is saying. She lowered her voice further, though not from uncertainty, only from precision, that you manufactured the evidence yourself, that you falsified records to make Grayson look guilty. Margaret went still. She had anticipated anger. She had anticipated skepticism. She had not quite anticipated this particular shape of attack, which was more sophisticated than she had credited Grayson with being able to orchestrate quickly. Who is she saying that to? Margaret asked. Anyone who will listen, Anna said. The banker mostly, and Reverend Cole. Why the banker? Margaret asked, though she thought she already knew. Because Harold Fenwick banks there, Anna said. And Fenwick's been saying things too, about why you really came to Montana, about your... Anna paused, choosing her word character. Margaret set down the can she was holding. She set it down carefully because she wanted to set it down carefully. Anna, she said, thank you for telling me. What are you going to do? Anna asked. Go back to work, Margaret said, and let the numbers speak. She went back to work. That evening, Nathaniel came to the supply barn earlier than usual, before the day's light had fully gone. He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands, and she read his face immediately. What happened? She said. Grayson couldn't produce documentation, Nathaniel said. I told him to pack his things and be off the property by morning. And he told me I was making the biggest mistake of my professional life. That I was a fool being manipulated by a desperate woman. Nathaniel paused. His words. Yes, Margaret said. I assumed something like that. He also said he'd make sure everyone in the county knew the kind of woman I'd brought onto my property. Nathaniel's voice was level. His hands, she noticed, had tightened slightly on the brim of his hat. He used language I won't repeat to you. Margaret stood. She came around the table and stopped in front of him close enough for directness. Nathaniel, she said, look at me. He looked at her. I have been called things before, she said. By people who knew less than Grayson and had less reason to be angry. I am standing here. I intend to keep standing here. Is my position at this ranch secure? Something moved through his face. Your position at this ranch, he said, is not in question. Not for a single minute. Not by anyone whose opinion I care about. Then I'll be back at that table in the morning, Margaret said. And I'd like when you have time to talk to you about the supply projections for fall. I think we can reduce the feed costs by roughly 15% if we adjust the ordering schedule. Nathaniel stared at her. 15%, he said. Approximately, she said. I'll have the exact figure by Thursday. He was quiet for a moment. Then, you just heard that Grayson is out there telling the whole county you're a fraud, and you want to talk about feed costs. The feed costs are real, Margaret said. What Grayson says is not. And then Nathaniel Brooks laughed. It was not a loud laugh. It was not a performed laugh. It was the genuine startled laugh of a man who had not expected to laugh just then and couldn't prevent it. A brief, full sound that changed his whole face and was gone in a moment, leaving behind something warmer than his usual expression. Margaret felt something move in her chest, small and distinct and inconveniently timed. She turned back to her table. Thursday then, Nathaniel said. Thursday, she said. He left. She sat with the ledger open in front of her and the lamp burning low, and she thought about the way a man's laugh could be inconvenient, and she thought about $481 and what it took to find it, and she thought about what Grayson was out there saying and what she could and couldn't control. She could control the numbers. She went back to the numbers. The following week was the hardest she had yet spent in Willow Creek. Grayson moved fast. She had underestimated his network, his 14 years of accumulated relationships in the county, the goodwill he had built that could now be spent against her. She felt it in the general store where the storekeeper was abruptly less efficient at finding her orders. She felt it in the way 3 ranch hands who had been neutral toward her became cautious, then cool. She felt it most acutely on Wednesday afternoon when a man she did not know stopped her on the main street of Willow Creek and said with absolute confidence, "You ought to be careful, miss, making enemies of men who've been here longer than you." She stopped. She looked at him. "I appreciate the warning," she said evenly. "You can tell Mr. Grayson the same, that I'd advise him to be careful making enemies of the truth. It's been here longer than any of us." She walked on. Anna told her that evening, appearing at the ranch, as she occasionally did, now that the banker had spoken with Nathaniel directly, that he had suggested carefully, and with many qualifications, that employing Margaret Ellison was a liability the ranch could not afford in the current social climate. "What did Nathaniel say?" Margaret asked. Anna smiled. "He told Mr. Carver that his supply records were now the most accurate they had been in 5 years, that his ranch costs had already dropped by $11 a month, and that if Mr. Carver had a problem with his hiring decisions, he was welcome to take his account elsewhere. Margaret was quiet for a moment. "He said that," she said. "Word for word," Anna said. Mr. Carver did not take his account elsewhere. She left Anna's company and stood alone for a moment in the evening air, and she held that piece of information. Nathaniel standing in a banker's office, defending her to a man whose opinion he needed, and she felt it the way you feel things you are not yet prepared to name. The twist came on a Friday, and it came from the last direction she would have chosen. She was in the supply barn finishing the fall projections when Ruth appeared in the doorway, which was unusual. Ruth moved through her domain with purpose and efficiency, and never appeared somewhere without a reason for being there. "There's someone here to see you," Ruth said. "He came to the house. He asked for you by name." "Who is it?" Margaret said. Ruth's expression was unreadable in the particular way it became when Ruth had already formed a strong opinion and was choosing not to deliver it yet. "He says his name is Harold Fenwick," Ruth said. Margaret's pen stopped. She set it down. She breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth, one deliberate breath, the way she had learned to do in moments that required composure she had to manufacture rather than feel. "Where is he?" she said. "Front of the house," Ruth said. "I told him to wait." Margaret stood. She straightened her apron. She looked at the fall projections on the table, neat and precise and entirely real, and then she walked out of the supply barn and around to the front of the ranch house. Harold Fenwick was standing in the yard. He was taller than she had imagined from his letters. She realized she had never been given cause to imagine him physically before because she had never expected to see him. He was perhaps 40, fair-haired, with a face that was pleasant enough in a way that conveyed very little about the person behind it. He was dressed well. He held his hat in both hands, which she noted. He looked at her. She stopped 10 feet from him and did not close the distance. "Miss Ellison," he said. "Margaret." "Mr. Fenwick," she said. He opened his mouth and then closed it. Then, "I owe you an apology." "You do," she said. He looked as though he had expected her to say something more gracious than that, and his slight surprise at not receiving it was itself informative. "I handled the situation very poorly," he said. "The way you were informed, that was wrong. I should have written to you directly. I should have given you time to make other arrangements." "You should have," Margaret said. "I panicked," he said. "Patricia's father. The timing, I panicked, and I made a coward's choice, and I have thought about it since." "That's good," Margaret said. "Thinking about it is useful. What brings you here today?" He hesitated. "I heard you were having difficulties with Grayson. I wanted you to know that I've spoken to some people in town on your behalf. I thought that perhaps I could help." Margaret studied him. She studied him carefully with the same systematic attention she gave to a ledger that wasn't adding up correctly. "Mr. Fenwick," she said. "Why?" "Because I caused harm," he said. "And I'd like to correct some of it." "That's one reason," she said. "What's the other?" I was quiet. "Mr. Fenwick," she said. "I appreciate that you came. I appreciate that you feel badly about what you did. And I believe that you do feel badly. I'm not doubting your sincerity. But if there is another reason you're standing in Nathaniel Brooks's yard with your hat in your hands, I'd like to hear it plainly." He exhaled. "Patricia and it's not been easy. She's not—" He stopped himself. "I made the choice I made. I'm not here to undo it." A pause. "But I've heard people talk about you since you arrived, about what you've built, what you found in those books. How you handled Grayson." He looked at her with an expression that was specific and slightly rueful. "I made a mistake." "Yes," Margaret said. "You did." She held his gaze for a long moment. "I don't wish you harm, Harold," she said. It was the first time she had used his given name, and she used it deliberately because she meant what she was saying, and she wanted him to hear it as a real statement from a real person, not a performance. "I am not going to help you feel better about what you did. That's work you have to do yourself. But I also don't carry hatred around with me, because it's heavy, and I have other things to carry." She paused. "If you've spoken to people in town on my behalf, I'm grateful for that. If you're a decent man underneath the bad choices, then be one. That's all I have for you. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. He put his hat on. You're not what I expected, he said. No, Margaret said. I imagine not. He left. She stood in the yard for a moment after his horse was gone, and then she heard boots on the porch steps behind her, and she knew without turning who was there. How long were you listening? She said. Long enough, Nathaniel said. She turned. He was on the porch step, arms crossed, expression composed. But his eyes were doing that thing, that particular quality of attention that she had come to recognize as Nathaniel Brooks at his most present, most there, most watching. You heard what I said to him, she said. Every word he said. And I was quiet for a moment. I've met a lot of people in my life who claimed they didn't carry hatred, he said. Most of them were lying or fooling themselves, the ones who were telling the truth. He paused. You can tell them apart. They sound different. How do I sound? Margaret asked. Nathaniel looked at her from the porch step with the full, unguarded weight of his attention. Like someone who's put in the work to get there, he said. The hard kind, the kind that doesn't happen by accident. She held that. She did not look away from him, and he did not look away from her. The fall projections are finished, she said finally. I'll look at them tomorrow, he said. Thursday, I said. I'd like to look at them tomorrow, he said. She almost smiled. She turned it into something more neutral before it fully arrived. Tomorrow then, she said. She walked back toward the supply barn, and behind her, Nathaniel remained on the porch step, and she did not look back, but she was aware in the specific and inconvenient way she had been aware of him since the first afternoon in the broken shelter of exactly where he was. Inside the numbers waited. Neat, honest patient as the man they served. She sat down and went back to work. The fall projections meeting lasted 4 hours. It was supposed to last 1. Nathaniel had come to the supply barn the morning after Harold Fenwick's visit with his coffee and the expression of a man prepared to review numbers for an hour and return to his regular work, and somewhere around the 3rd page of Margaret's analysis, he had stopped performing the polite attention of an employer reviewing an employee's report and started actually thinking, which was a different thing entirely and took considerably longer. You're saying we've been overpaying the billing supplier for grain by how much? He said. Across a full year, approximately $63, Margaret said. The Hargrove Mill in Junction charges 8 cents less per bushel. The distance is 11 miles further, but the quarterly haul consolidates cleanly with the lumber runs we're already making. Nathaniel looked at the numbers. He looked at them the way he looked at things when he was genuinely reckoning with them, not just processing. Show me the haul schedule. She showed him. He was quiet for a while. Then, Grayson knew about Hargrove. I know, Margaret said. He told me the quality wasn't reliable. The quality is excellent, Margaret said. I wrote to 3 ranches that use them regularly. All 3 confirmed. I have the letters. Nathaniel looked up from the papers. You wrote to other ranches. To verify before I presented it to you, she said. I didn't want to recommend a change based on numbers alone without confirming the operational reality. He was quiet again. Longer this time. He steered me away from Hargrove because Hargrove wouldn't pay him, Nathaniel said. It wasn't a question. He was working it out, following the shape of it now that he could see the shape. The billing supplier had an arrangement with him. That would be consistent with the pattern in the records, Margaret said carefully. I can't confirm that specifically, but yes, it would fit. Nathaniel set the papers down. He put both hands flat on the table and stood there a moment, and Margaret watched him absorb the full weight of 14 years of trust that had been used against him, and she did not say anything because there was nothing useful to say. All right, he said finally. Change the supplier. I'll write to Hargrove this week. And Margaret. Yes. Go back as far as you can on the billings account. I want to know the full number. I'll have it by Monday, she said. He picked up his coffee, which had gone cold during the 4 hours, and drank it anyway, and walked out. Ruth appeared in the doorway approximately 45 seconds later, which meant she had been within hearing range for most of the morning. He doesn't usually drink cold coffee, Ruth said. He was distracted, Margaret said. He doesn't usually get distracted either, Ruth said, and went back to the house before Margaret could decide how to respond to that. The Billings account fully traced came to $612. Margaret wrote the number at the bottom of a clean page on Monday morning and looked at it for a moment. Then she wrote it again on a separate page with every supporting document listed beneath it. Then she went to find Nathaniel. He was eating breakfast in the kitchen when she came in, which was unusual. He generally ate before she arrived. Ruth was at the stove and did not turn around. 612, Margaret said. She put the page on the table beside his plate. He looked at it. He did not pick it up. $612, he said. Yes. He pushed back from the table and stood. He went to the window. He stood there long enough that Ruth finally turned from the stove and looked at Margaret with an expression that said clearly and without words that she should wait. Margaret waited. I want to take this to the county sheriff, Nathaniel said. His back was still to the room. Not for the money, for the record. I want it documented legally so he can't come back here and claim it was a misunderstanding. That's the right decision, Margaret said. He turned. His face had the look of a man who had moved through anger and come out the other side into something cooler and more deliberate. Will you come with me to speak to the sheriff? If you want me there, she said. I want you there, he said. You understand the documentation better than I do, and, he paused. I want it on record that this came from your work, your name on it. She looked at him. My name, she said. Your name, he said. You found it. You documented it. You should have the credit for it, not be standing behind me while I present your work as though I did it. Something in Margaret's chest performed the same small, distinct, inconvenient movement it had been performing with increasing frequency in Nathaniel Brooks's presence. Thank you, she said. She said it simply because it was a simple and genuine thing. Thursday, he said. We ride to town. She nodded. She turned to go. Margaret, Ruth said from the stove. She turned. Ruth was looking at her now with the direct, comprehensive gaze that Ruth applied to everything she considered important. Sit down, she said. You haven't eaten either. It was not a request. Margaret sat down. Ruth put a plate in front of her. Nathaniel sat back down at the table. They ate breakfast in the ranch kitchen. The three of them without much conversation, and it was one of the most ordinary and unexpectedly weighted moments Margaret had yet spent in Montana, the specific domestic gravity of a shared table, the smell of Ruth's coffee. Nathaniel across from her with his cold expression warming slightly in the morning light. She ate every bite. The ride to town on Thursday should have been straightforward. They were halfway there when they met Grayson on the road. He was coming the other direction on horseback, and there was a moment, a brief suspended moment, where all three of them registered the encounter simultaneously and made their separate calculations. Nathaniel kept his horse at the same pace. Margaret kept hers. Grayson pulled up. Nat, he said. His eyes moved to Margaret. They stayed there. Walter, Nathaniel said, and kept riding. I hear you're headed to town, Grayson said, turning his horse to face them. I hear you've got papers. Then you've heard correctly, Nathaniel said. He stopped. He turned his horse. He looked at Grayson with the full, steady attention of a man who was not going to be hurried. You have something to say it. Grayson said nothing for a moment. He was looking at Margaret. You've let a woman who's been here 6 weeks poison 14 years, he said. I want you to hear yourself, Nat. 6 weeks against 14 years. The money's been missing for 22 months, Nathaniel said. The weeks don't change that. She made those numbers say what she wanted them to say, Grayson said. His voice was rising now, losing the control he had maintained in the house that first morning. She's been working you since the day she arrived. You think she cares about your ranch? She needed a man, and Fenwick didn't want her, and now she's found another way to make herself necessary. Mr. Grayson, Margaret said. He stopped. She had not raised her voice. She spoke at normal volume evenly the way she always spoke. The documentation is signed, sourced, and witnessed, she said. Every claim has a paper behind it. You're welcome to challenge any specific entry when we're with the sheriff. If there's an error, I want to know about it. If there isn't... She paused. Then what you're saying right now has nothing to do with the numbers and everything to do with the fact that you were caught. Those are different problems. Grayson stared at her. You should move us aside, she said. We have an appointment. The silence stretched long enough to be meaningful. Then Grayson wheeled his horse and rode past them without another word fast enough that the sound of hooves faded quickly. Nathaniel watched him go. Then he looked at Margaret. Every time, he said. Every time what, she said. Every time I think I've seen the limit of what you're capable of, he said. You do that. She turned her horse back toward town. Let's not be late, she said. But he kept looking at her for another moment, with that particular expression she had stopped trying to categorize, and then he turned his horse and rode beside her, and they didn't speak again for the rest of the ride, which was a comfortable silence and therefore its own kind of statement. Sheriff Dale Purcell was a methodical man who read every page of Margaret's documentation before he said a word. He read it twice. He asked 3 questions, all of them precise and directed at specific entries, and Margaret answered each one from memory without needing to refer back to the papers. The sheriff looked at Nathaniel. She put this together herself. Every page, Nathaniel said. Purcell looked at Margaret with an expression she recognized, the expression of a man recalibrating an assumption he hadn't been aware he was holding. Miss Ellison, he said, this is the clearest financial documentation I've seen presented in this office in 6 years. Thank you, Margaret said. I'll have a conversation with Grayson by end of week, Purcell said. Depending on what he says, this may go to the circuit judge. That's your call to make, Nathaniel said. I've got what I needed, the record. They shook hands. Purcell nodded at Margaret, with the specific nod of a man offering respect he hadn't originally budgeted for. Outside on the street, Nathaniel stopped walking. Coffee, he said, before we ride back. It was not quite a question. Margaret considered it for exactly as long as it took her to decide she wanted the coffee. All right, she said. They went to the bakery. Anna's bakery. And Anna Kelsey looked up from behind the counter and took in the 2 of them together and assembled an expression of extraordinary neutrality that fooled neither of them. Miss Ellison, Anna said warmly. Mr. Brooks. She poured the coffee before they sat down. They sat at the small table near the window, and for a while they simply drank the coffee, and the town moved past the glass outside, and Margaret was aware of people looking at the bakery window, at the 2 of them sitting together, and she was aware of what that looking meant in a small town, and she found that she did not particularly mind it. Ruth thinks you work too many hours, Nathaniel said. Ruth works more hours than I do, Margaret said. That's what I told her, he said. She didn't find it relevant. Ruth never finds anything relevant that doesn't support her existing position, Margaret said. Nathaniel almost smiled. No, he said. She doesn't. A pause. She also thinks, Nathaniel said, that I should offer you a more formal arrangement. Margaret looked at him. With the ranch, he said quickly enough that it was clear he felt the clarification was necessary. She thinks the supply manager title doesn't reflect what you actually do. She's been making that case to me with some frequency. And what do you think? Margaret said. I think Ruth is usually right about things, he said. And I think... He stopped. He looked at his coffee cup. He looked back at her. I think you've changed the way this operation runs, in 6 weeks, significantly. And that deserves to be recognized as what it is. Which is what, she said. Partnership, he said. Or the beginning of it if you're willing. The words sat in the air between them. Margaret turned her coffee cup in her hands. She thought about arriving in this town with $32 and a broken letter. She thought about the shelter, the boards she had pulled out of the ruin of someone else's attempt, the corner post that was rotted through. She thought about $612 and Ruth's apple pie and a man who had stayed to work past dark without announcement. What does that mean practically? She said. It means a fair share of the cost savings you generate goes back to you, he said. It means your name on the supply contracts. It means you have a seat at the table when we make decisions that affect the operation. He paused. It means I stop treating what you do here as a service I hired and start treating it as what? She said. He looked at her directly. As something I couldn't run this place properly without, he said. Anna behind the counter was making a great deal of noise, reorganizing cups that had not needed reorganizing. Margaret looked at Nathaniel for a long moment. "I'll think about it," she said. "All right," he said. "I'll give you an answer by Friday," she said. "All right," he said again. She thought he might push, and he didn't, and that was perhaps the most persuasive thing about him. The storm came that night. Not the social storm, though, that was building also, in the way that social storms built in small places, slow and inevitable. The actual storm. The kind that came off the mountains in August, without sufficient warning, that arrived in the early hours, when the sky turned a specific shade of green that experienced ranchers recognized and inexperienced ones described later as the most frightening thing they had ever seen. Margaret woke to the sound of the wind at 2 in the morning and knew immediately what it was. She dressed fast. She went to the window of her shelter and looked out at the sky, and the sky was wrong in the way Nathaniel would have recognized. She had not grown up in Montana. But she had been paying attention, and she had heard Dade and Sam and Eli talk about the late summer storms, and she had stored that information the way she stored all information completely without knowing when she would need it. She needed it now. She ran. The ranch was already awake when she arrived. Ranch animals knew before people did, and the sounds coming from the corrals were the sounds of horses that understood what was coming. She found Sam at the equipment barn moving fast and Eli at the corrals, and she went directly to the feed barn because the feed barn was where the most recent supply investment was stored, the new grain from Hargrove, the hay she had ordered on a revised schedule, the seed stock that needed to stay dry. "The east barn door," she said to Sam as she ran past him. "The latch is loose. I put it on the list 3 days ago." "I know," Sam said. He changed direction without question. She reached the feed barn and went to work. She had the interior layout in her head, the way she had every part of the operation in her head, exactly where everything was, exactly what needed to move to higher ground, exactly what needed to be secured, versus what could withstand water if it got in. She worked in the dark and by feel for the first few minutes, because she hadn't taken time for a lantern, and then Eli appeared with one, and held it without being asked. Because in the weeks since the Carter incident, Eli had developed what could only be described as a policy of appearing exactly when he was most useful. "The east corner," she said. "The seed stock has to move." "How far back?" "All the way, against the interior wall, and the new grain we need to elevate it." "On what?" She looked around the barn with the lantern's light. "The old stall dividers, in the back. Lay them flat 2 deep. We need 4 inches of clearance minimum." He was moving before she finished the sentence. The wind hit full force approximately 20 minutes after she'd arrived at the barn, and it was the kind of force that made the structure flex and creak and say things in the language of stressed timber that were not reassuring. Margaret kept working. Her hands were going again. She had broken the healing skin on her right palm, somewhere in the first few minutes of lifting, and she was aware of it in the background of everything. A familiar burn she had stopped paying primary attention to weeks ago. The east barn door blew open. The latch Sam had gone to fix had not held, or perhaps Sam hadn't reached it in time, or perhaps the wind simply overruled the latch. It didn't matter which. The door was open, and the wind was coming in, and the rain behind the wind was horizontal, and the grain she had just elevated was directly in its path. Margaret moved. She crossed the barn at a run and hit the door with her full weight, and it resisted her because the wind was hitting it from the other side with considerably more than her full weight. She planted her feet and pushed. The door moved 4 inches. She pushed again. 6. The rain was hitting her face and her shoulder and her arm, the cold of it shocking in the August heat she had gotten used to. And she heard someone shout behind her, and then Nathaniel was beside her. His hands went to the door above hers. He pushed. Together they pushed the door closed, and he threw the backup bolt, the manual one, high on the frame that the broken latch didn't control, and the wind screamed against the outside of it, and the door held. They stood in the noise of the storm, with the barn door solid between them and the wind, and for a moment neither of them moved. They were breathing hard, both of them, and the rain had come in enough to soak them both in. The 15 seconds the door had been open, and Nathaniel's arm was against her shoulder, and his hands were still on the door above hers. She became aware of this in sequence. She stepped back. He stepped back. They looked at each other in the lantern light with rain dripping from their hair and their clothes, and the storm continuing its argument with the outside of the barn. "The seed stock," she said. "Eli's got it," Nathaniel said. He was looking at her hand, the right one where the palm was bleeding again. "Margaret." "It's fine," she said. "It's not fine," he said. "Stop moving it." "I have work." "Eli has the seed stock," he said. "Sam has the corrals. I have the main barn. You have done what needed doing in here." He looked at her steadily. "Stop. Moving. It." She stopped. He tore a strip from the inside hem of his work shirt without ceremony, without drama, just the quick tear of a man who needed a bandage and didn't have one, and he reached for her hand. She let him. He wrapped her palm with the same efficient care he brought to practical problems, tying it off cleanly his head, bent over her hand and his fingers careful in the way that careful meant something specific, coming from a man whose hands were not naturally gentle. He did not let go of her hand immediately when he was done. He held it for a moment, just a moment. "You ran here," he said, "from your shelter, in the dark, before anyone called you." "The east barn door latch," she said. "I put it on the maintenance list 3 days ago. I knew it would go." "That's not why you ran," he said. She looked at him. "You ran because it's yours," he said. "The grain, the seed stock, the supply investment. You built it, and you know every piece of it, and you weren't going to stand in your shelter and watch a storm hit something you built." She held his gaze. "Yes," she said. He let go of her hand. Outside the storm continued, making its case loud and committed, but the barn held, and the seed stock was safe, and the east door was bolted, and the specific crisis was over, even if the storm was not. "Friday," Nathaniel said. She blinked. "What?" "Your answer," he said. "About the partnership. You said you'd give it to me Friday." She looked at him. "You're asking me this right now," she said. "In the middle of a storm, with rain in your hair." "Yes," he said. "I'm asking you right now." She was quiet for a long moment, listening to the storm batter the barn, feeling the specific truth of what he had just said. "You ran because it's yours," settle into something she recognized. "Yes," she said. "The answer is yes." Nathaniel looked at her. Something in his face opened briefly. Not a smile. Something behind a smile. Something more fundamental, and then composed itself again. "Good," he said. "Good," she said. Eli appeared from the back of the barn. "Seed stock is secure, ma'am." He looked at the two of them standing in the lantern light with rain-soaked clothes, and his face arranged itself into the expression of a 20-year-old man choosing to notice nothing. "Thank you, Eli," Margaret said. "Yes, ma'am," Eli said. He went back to the seed stock. The storm blew itself out by morning. The damage was real, but manageable. 2 sections of fence line down some roofing on the equipment barn that would need replacing a section of the corrals that had taken the worst of the wind. Margaret walked the property at first light with Nathaniel and Sam and Dade, assessing, making the list in her head, calculating what the repair would cost against the current supply budget. "The fence line is priority," Nathaniel said. "Agreed," Margaret said. "The corral section can wait 2 weeks without risk. The equipment barn roof needs to happen before the next rain." "I can get lumber from Hargrove on Thursday's run," Sam said, looking at her specifically. The use of Hargrove's name, she noted, had become unremarkable among the ranch hands. It was simply where they ordered from now. "Include the hardware," Margaret said. "I'll write the order this morning." They moved through the damage assessment efficiently, and there was something in the rhythm of it, the 4 of them working through the problem together, each person's knowledge complementing the others. Nathaniel's decisions, landing on the foundation of the information she and Sam and Dade provided, that felt different than the early weeks. Less like employment, and more like what Nathaniel had named it in the bakery, sitting across from her with coffee going cold between them. Partnership. The word had landed differently then than it landed now. She was still thinking about the difference when she went back to the supply barn to write the lumber order, and she was halfway through it when Anna Kelsey appeared in the doorway, which was unusual enough that Margaret set down her pen immediately. Anna did not have the appearance of someone delivering good news. "Tell me," Margaret said. "Grayson went to the banker yesterday," Anna said. "Before the storm. He didn't go to Carver." She paused. "He went to Marcus Webb." Margaret went still. Marcus Webb was the other banker in Willow Creek, the one whose institution held the mortgage on Brooks Ranch land. She knew this because she had found it in the financial records, noted it, and filed it away as relevant background. She had not expected it to become relevant this quickly. "What did he tell Webb?" Margaret said. "That the ranch books are being mismanaged," Anna said. "That a woman with no standing and no history in this county has been given access to confidential financial records and has been making unauthorized changes to supplier contracts." She paused again. "And that Nathaniel Brooks, her word was compromised. That his judgment cannot be trusted right now." The supply barn was very quiet. "Webb believed him," Margaret said. "Webb met with him for 2 hours," Anna said. "Webb and Grayson have hunted together for 10 years. Their wives are cousins." Margaret looked at the lumber order on the table in front of her. She looked at it for a long moment, reading the numbers without seeing them. "Does Nathaniel know?" she said. "Not yet," Anna said. "I came to you first." "Why?" Anna looked at her with the direct, slightly fierce regard that had characterized her from the first day she had fallen into step beside Margaret on the main street. "Because Grayson has spent 2 weeks telling this town that you're a woman with an agenda and no real competence," she said. "And Webb is about to use that story to put pressure on a man who trusted you. And I thought you deserved to know before it happened, so you could decide what to do about it instead of just having it happen to you." Margaret breathed in, breathed out. She picked up her pen. She finished the lumber order in 4 clean lines. "Thank you, Anna," she said. She set the pen down. She stood up. "Where is Nathaniel right now?" "North fence line," Anna said. "With Sam." She went to find him. How was where Anna said, working alongside Sam, on the downed section, the both of them moving with the focused efficiency of men doing physical work that required no discussion. She came across the field toward them, and Nathaniel registered her at a distance and read her face the way he always read it, and by the time she reached him, he was already handing his work gloves to Sam. "What is it?" he said. "Not a question," she told him. All of it directly in the order she had received it. Grayson, Webb, the 2 hours, the cousin wives. Nathaniel listened without interrupting. When she finished, he looked at the fence line for a moment. "Webb is going to call in the note," he said. "That's where this goes." "If he finds sufficient reason to claim mismanagement," Margaret said. "Yes, that's where it goes." "And Grayson is giving him the reason," Nathaniel said. "Grayson is trying to," she said. "He hasn't succeeded yet." Nathaniel looked at her. "What do you need?" She had expected to be the one asking that question. The fact that he had turned it on her so immediately, so instinctively. "What do you need?" Not, "What do we do?" Did something to her composure that she managed narrowly to contain. "I need 3 days with the complete financial records," she said. "I need to build a document that shows the ranch's fiscal position clearly enough that any banker, even one who hunts with Walter Grayson, cannot look at it and make a legitimate claim of mismanagement." "You have them," he said. "And I need you to request a meeting with Webb," she said. "Not to defend yourself, to present the numbers. Let the numbers do the defending." "Wednesday," Nathaniel said. "I'll write to Webb today." "Wednesday," she agreed. Sam, who had been working quietly at the fence with his back to them for the entire conversation, said without turning around, "You want help with anything on those records, ma'am, you say the word." "Thank you, Sam," Margaret said. "Yes, ma'am," Sam said. "Grayson's had this county running his way for too long." She looked at the back of Sam's head and felt unexpectedly, and with full force, the specific weight of what it meant to have earned the loyalty of people who had no obligation to give it. She walked back across the field toward the supply barn, and she thought about Webb and Grayson and 14 years of goodwill being deployed against her, and she thought about 3 days and what she could build in 3 days, and she thought about what Nathaniel had said in the lantern light with rain in his hair. "You ran because it's yours," She had said yes to a partnership in a storm-dark barn with a bandaged hand and rain dripping from her hair. And she had meant it, and Webb and Grayson, and the full force of their 10 years of hunting together, were not going to change that. She sat down at her table. She opened the ledger. She started building. 3 days later, Margaret Ellison walked into Marcus Webb's office with 47 pages of documentation and sat down across from a man who had clearly expected someone easier to manage. Webb was perhaps 60, with the smooth, careful affect of a man who had spent his career making financial pressure look like professional concern. He had Grayson's word. He had their history. He had the mortgage on 1,100 acres of Brooks Ranch land. He did not have 47 pages. "Mr. Webb," Margaret said, and placed the documentation on his desk. "I'd like to show you what the Brooks Ranch operation looks like from the inside." She walked him through it, page by page. The ledger reconstruction, the Grayson accounts, the billing supplier discrepancy, the new cost projections, the Hargrove contracts, the savings already realized in 6 weeks, $11 a month in recurring costs, $63 annually on grain, the projected fall savings she had presented to Nathaniel in the 4-hour meeting that was supposed to last one. Webb read. He made notes. He asked questions, and the questions were smart ones. She had expected that, and she had answers for all of them sourced to specific pages. Nathaniel sat beside her and said almost nothing. This had been her only condition for the meeting, that she present the documentation herself. He had agreed without argument. When she finished, Webb sat back in his chair. He looked at Nathaniel. "Your supply manager prepared this." "My partner prepared it," Nathaniel said. Something moved across Webb's face, a recalculation small and involuntary. "The Grayson matter," Webb said. He presented a different picture of the situation here. "Mr. Grayson had access to the ranch's financial records for 22 months while he was removing money from them," Margaret said. "He has a specific interest in the picture he presents." Webb looked at her. "Every figure in that document is sourced and verifiable," she said. "If there's a claim in Grayson's version that contradicts anything here, I'd like to know which claim, and I'll show you the paper behind my number." The office was very quiet. Webb looked at the 47 pages. He looked at Nathaniel. He looked at Margaret. "I'll need a week to review this fully," he said. "Of course," Margaret said. "Take the time you need." They stood to go. "Miss Ellison," Webb said. She turned. I was looking at her with the particular expression of a man who was not accustomed to revising his assessments and was finding the process uncomfortable. "Grayson told me you were a woman without standing in this county," he said. "Without history." "That's accurate," Margaret said. "He meant it as a liability," Webb said. "I know," she said. "I'm not certain he was right about that," Webb said. He said it slowly, with the specific reluctance of a man paying a compliment he hadn't planned to pay. Margaret held his gaze for one steady moment. "No," she said. "He wasn't." They walked out into the afternoon sun. Nathaniel waited until they had reached the horses. Then he said, "Partner," and the word had a quality she recognized, the same quality it had carried in the barn, in the storm in the dark. Not a title. A statement about something real. She untied her horse. "1 week," she said. "Then we'll know." "We already know," he said. She looked at him. "Webb's not going to call that note," Nathaniel said. "You showed him things he'd rather know than not know, and that matters to a man like Webb more than Grayson's story. He'll go back through the Grayson accounts himself now. He's going to find things." "Probably," she said. "You knew that going in," he said. "Yes," she said. "You built the document so he couldn't look away," Nathaniel said. "Not to defend us, to make him need to look." She put her foot in the stirrup. "The truth is easier to present clearly than a lie," she said. "That's all." She swung up into the saddle. Nathaniel mounted his own horse. He rode beside her out of town, and after a while he said quietly, "What you did in there." "Presented numbers," she said. "What you did," he said, as if she hadn't spoken. "I want you to understand that I see it." She looked ahead at the road. "I know you do," she said. "I'm not sure you do," he said. "Not fully." She did not answer that. She let it sit between them in the afternoon air, with the road running ahead of them and the ranch waiting at the end of it, and something she was still not ready to name, moving slowly and inevitably toward the surface of everything she had been carefully not examining. She rode. Beside her, Nathaniel rode, and between them, in the particular language of two people who had stopped needing to explain themselves to each other. Something that had been building for 6 weeks was getting ready to break through. Webb's letter arrived on a Tuesday. Margaret was in the supply barn when Ruth brought it, holding it with the careful neutrality of a woman who had opinions about its contents, and had decided for once to keep them until after the reading. She set it on the work table beside Margaret's ledger and stood back. Margaret looked at the envelope. Then she looked at Ruth. "Is Nathaniel in the house?" she said. "North pasture," Ruth said. "But I can send Eli." "Please," Margaret said. She did not open the letter until Nathaniel arrived. He came in still wearing his work coat with the quick stride of a man who had been given minimal information and wanted the rest of it immediately. He looked at the envelope on the table. He looked at Margaret. "From Webb," he said. "Yes." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "Open it," he said. She opened it. She read it once quickly, then once more slowly, because the first reading had been fast enough that she wanted to be certain she had it right. Then she set it flat on the table between them. Nathaniel read it himself. The letter was 2 pages. The first page was the language of a careful banker, measured, qualified professional. The second page was where the substance lived. Webb had reviewed the documentation. He had conducted his own independent inquiry into the billing supplier account and the secondary ledgers Margaret had identified. He had found in the course of that inquiry additional discrepancies she had not yet reached in her own work. 2 more supply accounts, a total of an additional $114. He was forwarding the complete file to Sheriff Purcell. He considered the matter of the Brooks Ranch mortgage fully resolved, and he wished to express in his careful banker's language that the financial management of the Brooks operation as currently constituted was among the soundest he had reviewed in recent years. "I used Margaret's name 3 times in 2 pages. Nathaniel set the letter down. 114 more, he said. "I hadn't reached those accounts yet," she said. "I had them on the list for next week." $726 total, he said. "Yes." He was quiet. Then, "Grayson is going to hear about this letter." "He probably already has," Margaret said. "Webb will have spoken to Purcell by now, and Purcell is not a man who moves slowly." Nathaniel stood. He walked to the barn door and stood in the opening with his back to her, the way he did when he was working through something that required movement, even when the movement was only standing. "He's going to come at you again," Nathaniel said. "Not through Webb, not through the official channels, because those are closed to him now. He's going to come at you personally." "I know," Margaret said. "I want to be clear about something." He turned. His face had the look it got when he was going to say something he had been deciding whether to say, and had made the decision. "Whatever comes next, whatever he does, you are not managing it alone. That's done. You've been handling his attacks by yourself since the day you found those ledgers, and I have let you because you're capable of it, and because you've made it clear that you don't need—" He stopped, started again. "I let you because it was your fight, and I respected that. But this is my ranch, and you are my partner, and whatever Grayson does next, he does it to both of us." Margaret looked at him for a long moment. "All right," she said. Something in his posture shifted slightly, as if he had been braced for an argument, and the absence of one required a physical adjustment. "All right," he said. Ruth appeared in the doorway behind him. Margaret had come to understand a sixth sense for moments of significance that operated at approximately a 30-second delay. She looked at the letter on the table. She looked at the two of them. "Good news," she said. It was not a question. "Very good news," Margaret said. Ruth nodded once with the expression of a woman who had expected nothing less. "I'll start supper early," she said, and disappeared. Nathaniel looked after her. "She's been cooking celebratory meals for this letter for 2 weeks, he said. "How do you know that?" Margaret said. "She bought a second chicken on the last supply run," he said. "Ruth does not buy a second chicken for ordinary occasions." Margaret laughed. It surprised her, the laugh, the fullness of it, the way it came without calculation or management. She heard it happen and felt briefly the slight shock of a woman rediscovering a thing about herself she had put away. Nathaniel was watching her with the expression she had stopped trying to categorize. She picked up the letter. She folded it carefully. She put it in the supply ledger where she kept the documents that mattered. Then she looked up and found him still watching. "Don't," she said. "Don't what?" he said. "Look at me like that," she said. "Like what?" he said, and he said it with the specific quality of a man who knew exactly what she meant and was asking anyway. She picked up her pen. "Go back to the north pasture," she said. "I have work to do." He left. But she heard as he went the particular cadence of his boots on the ground, unhurried, settled, the walk of a man who had gotten something he wanted without being able to say exactly what it was. She sat with her pen over the ledger and did not write anything for a full minute. Then she wrote the first number of the afternoon and kept going. Grayson came the following Thursday. He did not come to the ranch. He came to the town meeting. Willow Creek held a monthly meeting in the meeting hall above the general store, a gathering for practical community business, water rights, road maintenance, the kind of civic infrastructure that frontier towns needed and built with whatever they had available. Margaret had attended twice before because the water rights discussions were relevant to the ranch's irrigation planning, and because she had found in the weeks since the Webb letter that her presence in town carried a different quality. People looked at her differently. Not all of them. Mrs. Whitmore had not altered her expression by a perceptible degree, but enough of them that the general texture of entering a room had changed. She went to the Thursday meeting with Nathaniel and Anna's husband Thomas, who was a solid, quiet man who had apparently held a strong opinion in Margaret's favor from the beginning, but expressed it primarily through the volume of bread he included in the order when she came to the bakery. The meeting had been underway for 20 minutes when Grayson walked in. He did not look like a man who had been confronted with the full accounting of what he had done. He looked like a man who had made a decision about how he was going to handle that accounting, and the decision was forward. He sat in the second row. The water rights discussion continued for another 10 minutes, and Margaret kept her attention on the speaker and her hands still in her lap, and did not look at Grayson, though she was aware of him with the specific peripheral awareness of a woman who had learned to track threats without appearing to. When the moderator opened the floor, Grayson stood. "I'd like to speak to a matter of community concern," he said. His voice was even, controlled, the voice of a man who had prepared. The moderator nodded. "There are papers going around this county," Grayson said, "with my name on them, claims made by a woman who has been in this territory for less than 2 months against a man who has worked this land for 14 years. He turned slightly, not to look at Margaret directly, which would have been too obvious, but to address the half of the room that included her. "I want to speak to the character of those claims. Not the legal matter, I'll address that in the appropriate venue, but the character of them, where they come from and why." The room was quiet. "This woman arrived in Willow Creek abandoned," Grayson said. "Rejected. No home, no standing, no connection to this community. She attached herself to a man who had the decency to offer her work when she had nothing, and within weeks she had repositioned herself as essential to his operation. Within weeks she had accused the man who had genuinely built that operation of crimes." He paused. "I've watched this pattern before. A woman in a desperate situation finds a man worth attaching to and finds reasons to make herself necessary and remove anyone who might see clearly what she's doing." Several people were nodding. Several were not. Margaret sat very still. "The financial documents she prepared," Grayson continued, "were prepared by a woman with access to years of records and full knowledge of what she needed them to say to serve her purpose. I'm not saying she's not clever. I'm saying clever and honest are not the same thing." He sat down. The room turned almost as a single organism to see what would happen next. Nathaniel started to stand. Margaret put her hand on his arm. He looked at her. She shook her head. He sat. She stood. She did not wait for the moderator to recognize her. She stood and she let the room look at her, all of it, the full weight of 60-odd pairs of eyes, and she stood under it with her back straight and her hands at her sides, and she waited for the quality of attention to settle before she spoke. "Mr. Grayson," she said, and her voice was quiet enough that the room had to lean in to hear it, which was a choice she had made deliberately. You've said I'm clever. I'll accept that. You've said I'm desperate. I'd like to address that. She looked at him directly now. I arrived in this county with $32 and one suitcase, she said. That's accurate. I won't dress it differently. I had no home, no connection, no standing. Also accurate. She paused. What I also had was 14 years of bookkeeping experience, a knowledge of supply management, and the ability to look at a set of numbers and tell you what they mean. Those things I brought with me. Nobody gave them to me, and nobody can take them away. The room was very still. The documents I prepared were reviewed by Marcus Webb, she said. Mr. Webb then conducted his own independent inquiry. He found what I found, and he found more. Sheriff Purcell has those documents. They are available for review by any person in this room who would like to see them. She paused again. I prepared those documents because the money belonged to Nathaniel Brooks, and I work for Nathaniel Brooks, and it is my job to know where his money is. That is the complete explanation of my motivation. She looked around the room. Mr. Grayson says clever and honest are not the same thing, she said. He's right, they're not. You can be one without the other. But when you have both the numbers and the documentation and an independent banker's review, all saying the same thing. At some point, the question of motivation stops mattering, and the question of what is true starts mattering more. She sat down. Nathaniel said nothing. He put his hand briefly over hers on the armrest. A single moment of contact, deliberate and quiet, and then he withdrew it. She felt it for the rest of the meeting. The moderator moved on to the road maintenance discussion. People shifted in their seats and let the moment settle the way it needed to settle into the official silence of a community that had heard something and needed time to decide what it meant. After the meeting, standing outside in the evening air, 3 people came to speak to Margaret separately. The first was a rancher named Bert Hollis, perhaps 60, with the weathered look of a man who had been in Montana for 20 years and trusted physical evidence over social narrative. You're the one who found the Hargrove pricing, he said. Yes, she said. I've been paying Billings rates for 12 years, he said. He looked at her with the expression of a man doing a calculation he didn't like. Would you be willing to talk about suppliers sometime? Not for anything, just to talk. I'd be glad to, she said. He nodded. He walked away. The second was Reverend Cole, who shook her hand with the formality of a man making a public statement through a private gesture. Miss Ellison, he said, I owe you an apology. I listened to things I should have examined more carefully before repeating. Thank you for saying so, she said. Grayson was persuasive, Cole said. He usually is. Yes, Margaret said. That's what made him effective for 14 years. Cole looked at her with something that might have been respect, and definitely included surprise. He shook her hand again and went back inside. The third person was Clara Whitmore. Margaret did not expect this. She was so thoroughly unprepared for it that for a single moment her composure showed a gap which she closed quickly. Clara Whitmore stopped in front of her. She was not wearing the expression of a woman delivering a performance of sympathy over satisfaction. She was wearing the expression of a woman who had been wrong about something and was finding the experience uncomfortable in the specific way that long-held errors were always uncomfortable to release. I've said things about you, Mrs. Whitmore said, in this town, since you arrived. I know, Margaret said. Some of what I said was unkind, Mrs. Whitmore said. Some of it was not accurate. I believed. She stopped, started again. Walter Grayson has been a respected figure in this community for a long time. I believed his account of things. Many people did, Margaret said. He had years of goodwill to spend. Yes. Whitmore looked at her. I wanted you to know that I've heard what the documents say, and I've reconsidered. Margaret studied her. Mrs. Whitmore, she said. Reconsidering is a brave thing. Most people don't do it after they've committed to a position. I appreciate you telling me. Whitmore blinked. She had not clearly expected grace. She had expected something sharper, which would have been more comfortable, because it would have confirmed a version of Margaret she had already built. Well, Whitmore said, and her voice had shifted slightly, some of the stiffness going out of it. "I hope you'll that as if there are things I can do to be useful. I hope you'll consider—" "I'll consider it," Margaret said, kindly but not effusively, because she was not going to pretend more warmth than she had yet earned the right to feel. Whitmore nodded. She walked back to her husband, who was waiting by their carriage, with the expression of a man who had been watching and had drawn his own conclusions. Anna appeared at Margaret's elbow the moment Whitmore was out of earshot. "Clara Whitmore," Anna said. "Clara Whitmore apologized to you." "She reconsidered," Margaret said. "That's different from an apology, but it's more real." Anna stared at her. "How are you this calm right now?" Margaret thought about it honestly. "I'm not entirely," she said. "I'm just good at the outside part." Anna looked at her for a moment. Then she put her arm through Margaret's and said, "Come have supper with us. Thomas made bread this morning, and if we leave it much longer, he's going to eat it himself." Margaret let herself be steered toward the bakery, and behind her, she heard Nathaniel and Thomas Kelsey falling into easy conversation, and she let the ordinary human warmth of that settle over her, like something she had not known she was cold without. The next morning, Grayson came to the ranch. Margaret was at her table when she heard the horse, and she heard Nathaniel's voice outside, and she heard Grayson's voice responding, and she sat for exactly 15 seconds, deciding whether to go out. She went out. They were in the yard. Nathaniel on foot, Grayson still mounted, which was the spatial language of a man who hadn't decided whether to stay. Grayson looked at Margaret when she came out, and his face did something complex and rapid. "I came to speak to Nathaniel," he said. "I know," Margaret said. "I'm his partner. If you have something to say about the ranch, I'm part of that conversation." Grayson's jaw tightened. He looked at Nathaniel. Nathaniel said nothing. He simply stood, which was its own answer. Grayson got down from his horse. He stood with his reins in his hands, and he looked at the ground for a moment, which was a thing Margaret had not seen him do. He looked older than he had in the house that first morning, older than he had in the meeting hall the previous evening. He looked like a man who had been carrying something heavy for long enough that setting it down was its own kind of exhaustion. "The sheriff is coming to see me Friday," he said. "Purcell, with the full accounting." "I know," Nathaniel said. "I need to know if you're pressing it to the circuit judge," Grayson said. "I need to know if this is going to be—" He stopped. "My wife's family is in Billings. If this goes to a judge—" "Walter," Nathaniel said. His voice was not soft. It was not cruel either. It was the voice of a man who had moved entirely beyond anger into something harder and cleaner. "You stole from me for 22 months. You stole from people who worked for me because every dollar you took was a dollar that should have gone back into this operation. And when a woman founded a woman you'd never met, you tried to destroy her reputation in every room you could find." Grayson said nothing. "I'm not pressing for the judge," Nathaniel said. "Purcell will make his own determination, and I'll support whatever process he decides is appropriate. That's where it ends for me." He paused. "But I want you to understand something. If you say one more word against Margaret Ellison in this county, one word to one person, I will use every resource I have to make sure that conversation ends with a full accounting of what you did. Every dollar, every account, every lie you told to cover it." The silence that followed was complete. "Do you understand me?" Nathaniel said. "Yes," Grayson said. He looked at Margaret. She waited. She did not know what she expected from him. She had thought sometimes about what she would say if he ever stood in front of her with the social armor gone, with nothing left but the fact of what he had done and what he had tried to do to her. She had imagined several versions of that conversation, none of them particularly satisfying. What he actually said was, "I told myself you were after something, that it was easier to believe than the other thing." "What other thing?" Margaret said. "That you were just better at this than I was," he said. "That you walked in here and saw things I'd been hiding and found them in 3 weeks because you're just better at it." He looked at her with the expression of a man delivering a truth he had been resisting for months. That was easier to call manipulation than to call what it actually was. The yard was very quiet. "Mr. Grayson," Margaret said finally, "I don't need your acknowledgement. I have the numbers. She paused. But since you're offering it, yes. I found it because I was paying attention and I know what I'm doing. That's all it was. Another pause. It didn't have to be an either-or. If you'd been honest, I would have worked alongside you just fine. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he put his hat on. He mounted his horse. He rode out of the yard without looking back. Nathaniel and Margaret stood in the silence he left behind. Better at it than he was, Nathaniel said. Apparently, Margaret said. He's not wrong, Nathaniel said. I know, she said. But it would have been more useful if he'd realized it before 22 months and $700. Nathaniel made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but adjacent to one. Then he turned to look at her fully, with the same direct attention he had given her since the first afternoon at the shelter, the attention of a man for whom looking at something meant actually seeing it. There's something I need to say to you, he said. She waited. I've been careful, he said, about how I say things, to you. I've been... He looked for the word and found it. Precise. I've said things that were true, but stopped short of the larger true thing, because I didn't know if you were ready to hear it, or if I had the right to say it, or... He stopped again. I'm not a man who talks around things. This has been uncomfortable. She looked at him. Then don't talk around it, she said. He looked at her steadily. I don't want you to be my partner only, he said. I want... He stopped. He took a breath, which she had never seen him need to do before speaking. I have been watching you for 3 months, since the first afternoon. I watched you drive your heel through that letter and pick up your suitcase, and I watched you rebuild something broken with your own hands, and I watched you find $600 in my books and stand in front of this county and say what was true when it would have been easier to say nothing. He paused. I am not saying this because I feel sorry for you. I am not saying this because you need something from me. I am saying it because there is no version of what comes next for this ranch, for this life that I want to build without you in it. The yard was completely quiet. Nathaniel, she said. I know it's early, he said. I know you've been here 3 months, and you've been through enough that adding this on top of it is... I know the timing isn't... Nathaniel, she said again, and something in the way she said it made him stop. She looked at him. I drove my heel through that letter, she said. And then I walked to a general store and bought a handsaw with money I couldn't afford to spend. And I walked 1.5 miles to a pile of broken boards, and I started building. She paused. I did that because I decided I was done waiting for something good to happen to me. I was going to build it, whatever it was. I was going to build it myself. She looked at him steadily. And then you came back with lumber. He held very still. You didn't rescue me, she said. You showed up. There's a difference. And you kept showing up, every time, without announcement, without requiring anything back from it, without making me smaller in the process. She felt something shift in her voice and steadied it deliberately. I have been aware of you, Nathaniel Brooks, since the day you sat on the ground in the dark and ate hard biscuits with me and looked at that shelter like it was something worth looking at. He took 1 step toward her. That's a yes, she said before he could speak. In case the distinction matters. It matters, he said. He was very close now. Close enough that she could see the specific quality of his attention, all of it directed at her, nothing held back or managed. I'm not a simple woman, she said. I have opinions, and I keep accounts, and I will argue with you when I think you're wrong. I know, he said. I won't be made smaller, she said. Not by anyone. I know that too, he said. I wouldn't want you smaller. I want you exactly as you are. He paused. I have wanted you exactly as you are since the afternoon I watched you push a rotten board away and keep going. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached out and took his hand. His right hand, the one nearest her, and she held it the way he had held hers in the storm, with the same careful, deliberate grip. He closed his fingers around hers. They stood in the yard of the Brooks Ranch in the September morning and held on, and it was not a dramatic thing. No audience, no ceremony, no moment arranged for effect. Just 2 people who had arrived at the same place by different broken roads, standing in the ordinary light, holding on. Ruth appeared in the doorway of the main house. She looked at them. She turned around and went back inside. From within the house, clear enough to carry through the open kitchen window, came the sound of Ruth beginning to prepare something that involved Margaret was fairly certain the second chicken. "She's going to be insufferable about this," Nathaniel said. "She's going to be right about this," Margaret said. "Which is worse." "Yes," he said. "Considerably." They stood there a while longer, hands linked, and the ranch went on around them, the sounds of morning work. Sam's voice in the corrals, the smell of Ruth's cooking coming from the house, and it was hers, Margaret understood. All of it. Not because anyone had given it to her, because she had built it. Board by board, number by number, truth by truth. In a county that had watched an abandoned woman step off a stagecoach and made a long series of incorrect assumptions about what she would and wouldn't do next. But the morning was not finished delivering its surprises. An hour later, Margaret was back at her table with the ledger open, and Nathaniel's hand no longer in hers, but the warmth of it still present in some less literal way, when Eli appeared in the supply barn doorway with an expression she had learned to read as news he wasn't certain how to deliver. "There's a man asking for you," Eli said. "In the yard, not from around here. Came in on the morning stage." "Who is he?" she said. "Says his name is Thomas Ellison," Eli said. "Says he's your brother." Margaret's pen stopped. She had a brother. She had a brother named Thomas, who was 4 years younger than her, and who had last written to her 18 months ago from a mining claim in Colorado, a letter that had said he was doing well and would write more regularly, and who had not written more regularly, which was Thomas entirely. She stood. She walked to the barn door and looked out. There was a man in the yard. He was lean where she was not, and he had their father's coloring and their mother's mouth, and he was standing with his hat in both hands, looking at the main house with the expression of a man who was not certain of his welcome. He turned and saw her. His face did the thing it had done since they were children, when he saw her, a specific, uncalculated opening the face of a person who had learned to read safety in her presence. "Maggie," he said. She walked across the yard toward him. She was not certain what she felt standing in the September morning of the Brooks Ranch with her brother 20 feet away, and her partner in the house, and $726 recovered, and a shelter a mile and a half away, built from broken boards. She felt many things in layers, the way the country itself was layered. The old wounds underneath the new growth on top, the roots going down further than the visible part suggested. "Thomas," she said. He took 3 steps toward her, and she let him, and when he reached her, he put his arms around her briefly, the hug of a man not accustomed to the gesture, but attempting it, and she held on for a moment. "I heard what happened," he said into her shoulder. "With Fenwick. I heard months ago, but I was in Colorado, and I should have come sooner, Maggie." "Yes," she said. "You should have." He pulled back. He looked at her. Really looked the way people looked at someone they had been worried about and were reassessing in person. "You're all right," he said. It was not a question. He was simply saying what he was seeing. "I'm more than all right," she said. He looked around the ranch yard, at the supply barn, at the main house, at the organized, functioning, living evidence of 3 months of work. "I heard other things too," he said. "Not just about Fenwick." "Such as," she said. He looked at her with the specific expression of a younger sibling who has information he knows the older one will find complicated. "That you found $600 stolen from a rancher's books," he said. "That you took on the foreman and the banker and half of Willow Creek's social establishment." He paused. "That you built a house by yourself." "A shelter," she said. "There's a difference." "Maggie," he said. "I came because I wanted to make sure you were alive. Now I see you're—" He looked around the yard again. "You're running this place, aren't you?" "I'm a partner in this operation," she said. He processed this. "A partner," he said. "Yes." He looked at the house again, then back at her. "The rancher," he said carefully. "Is he? That is, are you and he?" "Thomas," she said. "I'm just asking." "I know what you're asking," she said. He waited. She looked at him for a moment. Then, "He came back with lumber," she said. Thomas looked at her. "When I was building," she said. "He came back with lumber, and he stayed to work, and he kept showing up, every time." Thomas was quiet for a moment, processing this, in the way he processed things slowly from several angles, arriving eventually at something solid. Then his face did the opening thing again, the unguarded thing. "Good," he said, simply and completely. "Yes," Margaret said. She put her arm through her brother's and turned him toward the main house. "Come inside," she said. "Ruth will feed you. And then you can tell me what you've actually been doing in Colorado for 18 months, because I want the real version, not the version you'd write in a letter." He laughed their father's laugh, which she had not heard in 4 years. It landed in her chest in the specific way that things land when you didn't know you had been carrying the absence of them. "The real version is worse," he said. "It always is," she said. "Come on." They walked toward the house together, and the September morning held them, and somewhere inside, Ruth was already adding to whatever she was preparing, because Ruth operated on the assumption that more people required more food, and in Margaret's experience, Ruth was right about most things. The door opened before they reached it. Nathaniel was in the doorway. He looked at Margaret. He looked at Thomas. He read the situation in a single comprehensive glance. "Thomas Ellison," he said, and held out his hand. Thomas looked at the hand. He looked at his sister. She nodded once. He shook Nathaniel's hand. "Come in," Nathaniel said. "Ruth made enough for 6. She always does." They went inside. And the ranch house, which had been a quiet place for a long time. A man's house with a man's specific and contained solitude. Running through every room was full of voices and the smell of Ruth's cooking, and the sound of people who had arrived at the same place by different broken roads sitting down together at the same table. Outside, the supply barn waited with its ledgers and its numbers and its careful record of everything that had been built. And 1.5 miles away, a small shelter stood on soundstones with straight walls and a solid roof boards that didn't match, and a window frame slightly crooked, still standing, still hers, the beginning of everything she had built since. Thomas Ellison stayed 3 days. He slept in the bunkhouse annex, ate Ruth's cooking, with the focused appreciation of a man who had been feeding himself from mining camp provisions for 18 months, and spent most of his waking hours either talking to Margaret or watching the ranch operation, with the expression of someone assembling a picture from pieces he hadn't expected to find arranged this way. On the second evening, he found her in the supply barn after supper. She was working on the winter supply projections. The full seasonal plan she had been building since the fall numbers confirmed what she had suspected about the ranch's previous ordering patterns. Thomas came in and sat in the chair across from her work table and watched her work for a while without speaking, which was something he had done since childhood, when he was preparing to say something he wasn't sure how to start. She kept writing. "You're happy," he said finally. She looked up. "Not performing it," he said. "Actually happy. I don't think I've seen that before. Not since before James died." James was her husband. She had not heard his name said aloud in a long time. "I'm building something," she said. "I'm good at what I do, and it matters and people know it. That's a significant part of it." "And the other part," Thomas said. She looked at him. He looked back with the expression of a younger sibling who had learned to read her face before he could read words and had never forgotten the skill. "He's a good man," Thomas said. "Not a question." "He's a careful man," she said. "And a fair one, and he shows up." She paused. "That's more than I knew to ask for." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "When James died," he said, "and the business went with him, you wrote to me and you said you were fine. And I believed you because I wanted to. And I shouldn't have." "Thomas," she said. "I should have come then," he said. "And I should have come when that whole business I should have come." "You're here now," she said. "That's not the same," he said. "No," she agreed. "But it's what I have, so it's what I'm working with. That's generally my approach." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "I'm proud of you, Maggie. I don't say things like that, but I need to say it." She held it. She held it the way you hold something that arrives after a long absence carefully, with full attention, understanding its value, precisely because you had known the want of it. Thank you, she said, and meant it completely. He left on the third morning. He had a claim in Colorado. He needed to get back to a real one this time. He said with 2 partners he trusted, which was an improvement over the previous 18 months, in ways he outlined briefly, and she understood were the edited version. He promised to write. She told him she would hold him to it with considerably more force than the previous version of that promise had carried. He laughed and hugged her again, less awkward this time, the gesture finding its own ease, and rode back toward the stage line. She watched him go, and then she turned back to the ranch, and the ranch was still there, still hers, still running with the particular ordered momentum of an operation that knew where everything was and why. She went back to work. October arrived with the specific authority of Montana, autumn cold in the mornings, and brief in its warmth, and completely unapologetic about both. The supply orders Margaret had placed in September arrived on schedule, the Hargrove grain filling the feed barn to the precise capacity she had calculated, the winter provisions organized according to the system she had built, every number matching its projected counterpart within acceptable margins. Nathaniel looked at the barn one morning with the expression of a man whose operation was running better than it had in years and was still slightly surprised by this. "You projected this number 4 weeks ago," he said, looking at the grain inventory. "I projected it 8 weeks ago," Margaret said. "I revised it 4 weeks ago. And the actual number is $3.40 under projection," she said, "on a $400 order, which is within 1%. He looked at her. "That's not luck," he said. "No," she said. "It's not." He had the expression he sometimes wore when she said something that landed harder than she had intended, which was the expression of a man receiving something he valued without having a word ready for the receiving of it. She had come to find this expression more affecting than she was entirely comfortable admitting. "The Hollis Ranch sent a letter," she said, returning to practical ground because practical ground was reliable. "Bert Hollis. He wants to talk about suppliers. I told him I'd meet with him next week if that's agreeable with you." "It's agreeable," Nathaniel said. "Do you want me there?" "I think he'll be more comfortable with just me initially," she said. "He has 12 years of paying billings rates, and he's going to need to feel he's making his own decision rather than being told what to do." "You've already worked out how to manage it," Nathaniel said. "I've thought about it," she said. He looked at her with the steady, particular attention that she had stopped trying to be unaffected by. "Margaret," he said. "I know that tone," she said. "That's the tone you use when you're about to say something you've been working up to." "Is it?" he said. "You've been using it for 3 days," she said. "Since Thomas left." He was quiet a moment, a concession she understood to the accuracy of the observation. "I want to show you something," he said. "This afternoon, if you can spare the time." She looked at her projections. "After the noon inventory check," she said. "Afternoon," he agreed. He came for her at 12:30, and they rode out together, which had become an unremarkable feature of the ranch's daily rhythm. The two of them moving through the operation side by side, consulting, deciding, working through whatever the day presented. The hands had stopped marking it as notable. Ruth had never found it notable because Ruth had seen it coming from approximately the 3rd week and had simply been waiting for everyone else to catch up. They rode north across the ranch land, further than the usual work, took them into the section where the property ran up against the tree line, and the country opened into the long view that Margaret had come to consider one of the specific gifts of Montana, the land running out to the edge of the visible world. Nothing between you and the horizon, but grass and sky and the enormous western light. Nathaniel pulled up. Margaret pulled up beside him. Howe was looking at a section of land she hadn't spent time in further north than the current operations ran, a piece of ground that sat inside the Brooks property boundary but hadn't been actively worked in several years. "I've been thinking about expanding the operation," he said. "The supply numbers you've built give me enough margin to consider it. A second hay operation here running as a connected but separate account from the main ranch." She looked at the land. She was already running calculations. "The water access," she said. "There's a creek running through the eastern edge," he said. "Rights are clear." "Labor," she said. "We'd need 2 additional hands for the first season," he said. The bunkhouse can accommodate 4 more. We have the capacity. Startup cost, she said. I've been working on that projection, he said. I'd like your numbers to check against mine. She looked at the land for a long moment. She was seeing it the way she had learned to see things, not as it was, but as what it could be with the right application of attention and work and honest reckoning. It's viable, she said. I'd want to run the full numbers before you commit. Of course, he said. But looking at it, yes, it's viable. He turned to look at her, and she could tell from the particular quality of his attention that the land had not been the only thing he brought her out here to discuss. I want your name on it, he said. She looked at him. My name. On the deed for this section, he said, when we develop it, your name beside mine. The October wind moved between them, cold and direct, the kind that carried the first real promise of winter. Nathaniel, she said, I want to be precise about this, he said, which was what he said when he was going to say something he had thought about carefully and was going to say exactly once. I'm not asking you because I need a supply manager. I'm not asking because you've been useful to this operation, though you have been completely. I'm asking because every decision I've made since August has been better because you were part of making it. Because I sleep better, knowing you're a quarter mile away, than I did when I had the whole county between us, and I didn't know you existed. He paused. And because I intend to ask you something specific in a specific way at a specific time that is not right now, because I want to do it correctly. But I want you to know before that moment, I want you to know what my intention is. Margaret held very still. And what is your intention? She said. To spend the rest of my life building something with you, he said. With your name on it. All of it. Not as a courtesy, as the plain truth of what it is. She looked at him. She looked at him for a long time, and she thought about a letter driven into the dirt of a Montana street, and a handsaw that cost more than she could afford, and a corner post rotten through at the base, and hard biscuits in the dark, and apple pie, and 47 pages of documentation, and a storm door held shut with both hands against a wind that had not been stronger than 2 people pushing back together. Nathaniel Brooks, she said. You are the least decorative man I have ever met. Something moved through his face. Is that? He started. It's the finest compliment I know how to give, she said. You mean what you say. You do what you mean. You showed up with lumber when you could have ridden on. She looked at him steadily, with the full attention she had learned in 32 years to give only to things worth giving it to. Yes, she said. My answer is yes. To the deed and to the specific question you're planning to ask at the specific time you've decided on, which I will pretend I don't already know is coming, so that you can do it the way you want to. I was quiet for a moment. You know, he said. I've known for 2 weeks, she said. You've been different. You're a consistent man, and you were different. I noticed. Of course you did, he said. Of course I did, she agreed. He almost smiled. Then he did smile, the full version, the one she had been collecting like evidence, each instance rare enough to be significant. It changed his whole face. The smile opened it in a way that his regular expression kept carefully closed, and she looked at it and felt the specific, irreversible quality of being known by someone who had taken the time to actually look. Thursday, he said. What? The specific time, he said. Thursday. All right, she said. They rode back to the ranch side by side, and the land ran out around them in every direction, and it was hers. Not because anyone had given it to her, not because she had married into it, or inherited it, or been granted it by any of the mechanisms through which women of her time and place were assigned value. It was hers because she had earned it. Number by number, board by board, truth spoken in rooms where the truth was inconvenient. Thursday came. Nathaniel asked her beside the shelter. He had ridden out there in the early evening, and she had known where he was going because Ruth had told her with the specific serenity of a woman delivering information she considers obvious, and Margaret had put on her better dress, not because she was performing anything, but because some moments deserved the best version of what you had, and walked the 1.5 miles across the land she knew as well as she knew her own hands. The shelter stood where it had always stood. Boards that didn't match window frame, slightly crooked door with the gap at the bottom she had never gotten around to fixing, because the hay bales had solved the winter problem well enough, and she had other priorities. Nathaniel was standing beside it with his hat in his hands. She came across the field toward him in the October evening light. He watched her come the way he had watched her the first afternoon, with the complete steady attention of a man who had decided something was worth seeing. She stopped in front of him. "You wanted to do this here," she said. "Yes," he said. "Because this is where it started," she said. "Because this is what you built when you had nothing," he said. "And I want you to know that I understand what that means. That I have always understood what that means from the first afternoon." He looked at the shelter, then back at her. "You didn't need rescuing, Margaret. You needed someone to show up. I'd like to spend the rest of my life being the person who shows up." He did not go to one knee, because he was a practical man, and the ground was cold, and she would have found theater uncomfortable. He simply stood in front of her, and held out his hand and said, "Marry me. Be my wife and my partner. Put your name next to mine on every deed and every document and every decision this ranch makes from now until we're both too old to make them, and then let's let our children argue about it." She took his hand. "Yes," she said. "Obviously yes." He closed his fingers around hers. They stood beside the broken board shelter in the October evening, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was the specific fullness of a life that had been rebuilt from the ground up by someone who had refused at every juncture to let the worst thing that happened to her become the final word about her. What happened after was not without difficulty. She would record this honestly, because dishonest stories are for people who need comfort more than they need truth. And Margaret Ellison had never been that person. Grayson appeared before the circuit judge in November. The hearing was documented and public, and Sheriff Purcell presented the complete accounting, $726, across 22 months, with Margaret's documentation as the primary evidence. Grayson's lawyer argued that the records had been prepared by a woman with a personal interest in the outcome, and Purcell presented Webb's independent confirmation, and the judge looked at 47 pages of sequential-sourced documentation and asked the lawyer if he had a specific factual objection to any specific entry. The lawyer did not. Grayson was ordered to repay the full amount with interest and was prohibited from holding any position of financial trust in the county for a period of 5 years. He moved to Billings in December. Margaret heard this from Anna, who heard it from the banker Carver, who heard it from Webb, who had apparently become a reliable secondary source on matters concerning the Brooks Ranch. She did not celebrate this. She noted it the way she noted all completed business and moved on to the next thing. The wedding was in November, 3 weeks after the hearing. Ruth organized it with the efficiency she brought to everything, and Anna Kelsey baked the cake, and Thomas came back from Colorado for it by some logistical miracle he had arranged before he left, which told Margaret that he had known when he met Nathaniel what was coming and had planned accordingly. He said nothing about this. She told him she knew. He said nothing about that either, which was the particular language of siblings who understood each other well enough to communicate in the gaps. Bert Hollis came to the wedding, which surprised her. He shook her hand before the ceremony with the grave formality of a man marking something significant. "I changed suppliers last week," he said. "To Hargrove." He paused. "Saving $11 a month already." "I'm glad," she said. "My wife wants to know if you'd be willing to look at our book sometime," he said. "Not for any particular reason. She read about the Grayson business and she thought, 'Tell Mrs. Hollis to come to the ranch,'" Margaret said. "Any Thursday. I'll have coffee ready." He nodded. He went to find his seat. She stood at the front of the small church in her best dress, with Nathaniel beside her, and Thomas on her left, and Ruth in the front row, with an expression of total composure that could not entirely conceal the satisfaction underneath it. And she said the words she meant, and listened to the words he meant, and it was not a fairy tale. It was better than a fairy tale. It was real. The first year of the marriage was also the first year of the northern expansion. The second hay operation went in on the section Nathaniel had shown her in October, running on the budget she had projected and supervised by a foreman. Margaret hired herself a woman's husband from Billings named Carson, who turned out to be exactly as capable as his references suggested, which was a pleasant surprise in a world where references were often optimistic. The operation came in 4% under budget in its first season. Margaret wrote that number in the ledger and looked at it for a long time. Then she wrote the next number and kept going. Mrs. Hollis came on Thursdays. Then 2 other women came with her ranchers' wives, who had been managing household accounts and supply orders without any formal framework, and who had Margaret discovered a tremendous amount of practical intelligence that had never been given a proper structure to work in. She did not charge them. She gave them the structure. She showed them what she had shown herself in the supply barn of the Brooks Ranch, that numbers told the truth if you knew how to ask them, and the asking was learnable. Anna, watching this develop over 3 months, said one afternoon, "You know what you're doing, don't you? You're not just helping them, you're building something." "I'm showing people what I know," Margaret said. "You're making it so that the next woman who arrives in this county without standing or history has somewhere to learn the tools," Anna said. "So she doesn't have to figure it all out alone." Margaret was quiet. She had not articulated it that way. But when Anna said it, she recognized it as true. "I suppose I am," she said. By the spring of 1885, 5 women were coming on Thursdays. By summer, 8. Ruth, who had been attending these sessions with the air of someone who had already known everything being discussed but found the company worth the time, said one evening after the last woman had gone home, "You should have a name for it." "A name for what?" Margaret said. "For what you're doing on Thursdays," Ruth said. Margaret looked at the table where 8 women had sat that afternoon with their ledgers and their questions and their specific determined intelligence. She thought about what to call it. "I'll think about it," she said. "Think fast," Ruth said. "Mrs. Hollis brought her daughter today. The girl is 14. She understood the supplier comparison before her mother did." Margaret smiled. She did think about it. She thought about it for a week, and what she settled on was not a formal name, but a simple description, which she wrote in the inside cover of the new ledger she started for the Thursday sessions. "Women learning to know where the money is and what it means." It was not elegant, it was accurate. Which was, she had always found better. The shelter was still standing in the autumn of 1885, 2 years after she had driven her heel through a letter in the main street of Willow Creek. She went out to it one October morning, the anniversary, though she hadn't kept track of the precise date until Ruth mentioned it with the certainty of a woman who kept track of everything. She walked the 1.5 miles the way she had walked it the first time in the early cool, with the light coming up ahead of her. It was smaller than she remembered. Or perhaps she was different than she remembered. Perhaps the woman who had crouched in the dirt of this place and pressed her thumb into a rotten corner post and decided it was workable. Perhaps that woman was the same woman standing here now. And perhaps standing here now, she was simply larger than she had been then in the ways that mattered. She heard a horse behind her. She did not turn. She knew the sound. Nathaniel pulled up beside her and dismounted, and stood where she was standing, looking at the shelter with the same quiet attention he had given it the very first afternoon when he had sat on his horse at the edge of the property and watched a woman work for an hour before he spoke. 2 years, he said. "Yes," she said. "How does it look?" he said. She considered it honestly. "Small," she said, "and solid, and exactly what it is." "What is it?" he said. She looked at the boards that didn't match the window frame that was still slightly crooked, the roof that had held through 2 Montana winters without apology. "It's the place where I decided," she said. "Decided what?" he said. She turned to look at him. This man who had come back with lumber, who had stayed to work past dark, who had driven to a banker's office and said partner, and meant it, who had stood beside a broken shelter in an October evening and asked her with his hat in his hands and no theater attached to the asking. "That I was going to build something," she said. "Whatever it took, whatever I had to work with. I was going to build something that was mine and would stand." He looked at her. "It stands," he said. "It does," she said. He reached over and took her hand. She let him. They stood in the October morning with the shelter before them and the ranch behind them and the full specific weight of everything they had built together, pressing quietly against the ordinary air. She thought about $32 and a handsaw and a letter driven into the dirt. She thought about 8 women at a Thursday table, learning to know where the money was. She thought about a corner post rotten through at the base that she had pressed her thumb into and said, workable. Everything worth building she had learned started with that, with a woman pressing her thumb into the worst of it and deciding she could work with what remained. Not because it was easy, not because she was certain, but because the alternative was to put down her tools and walk away, and Margaret Ellison had never once in her life put down her tools. The shelter stood. It had stood through storms and accusations, and a foreman's long dishonesty, and a town's collective assumption about what a large woman with no standing and no history could and could not do. It stood because she had built it with her hands and her knowledge, and her absolute refusal to let the worst morning of her life become the last word about her. And now it stood as evidence, not of what she had suffered, but of what she had decided to do with what came after the suffering. The difference between those two things was the whole story. Nathaniel's hand was warm in hers. The ranch waited behind them, running and real and documented to the last dollar, full of people who had learned to see her completely. Ruth with her cold assessment and her second chicken. Sam, who held doors and asked no questions. Eli, who appeared with lanterns at exactly the right moment. Anna, who fell into step on a main street because she knew what bravery looked like and wanted to stand near it. Thomas, who came back because being too late was better than never coming at all. And somewhere in Willow Creek on Thursday afternoons, 8 women sat at a table with their ledgers open and their questions ready, learning what Margaret had learned in a supply barn in the first weeks of her arriving, that numbers told the truth, and knowing the truth was power, and power was not something you waited to be given. It was something you built, board by board, with your own hands, from whatever was left, after the worst thing happened. Even if what was left was broken, even if what was left barely held together, even if every person watching told you it wasn't enough to work with. Margaret Ellison Brooks had pressed her thumb into the rot and called it workable. And everything that mattered had grown from that single stubborn, magnificent decision. She had arrived in Montana with nothing but her hands and her knowledge, and the particular courage of a woman who had decided that being left behind was not the same as being finished. She had been right. She had been completely, entirely, permanently right, and the shelter stood to prove it. Boards mismatched and window crooked and roof solid as the day she nailed the last beam into place, outlasting the letter, outlasting the man who wrote it, outlasting every assumption anyone had ever made about what a woman in her circumstances could and could not build. It stood, and so did she.